Have you ever received an offer that seemed like the answer to every prayer, only to realize too late that it was a lock clicking shut on your own cage? We all have our price, the exact amount of money it takes to make us look the other way when our instincts scream that something is wrong. I found my price on a freezing Tuesday afternoon, and it cost me everything I thought I knew about the world and about myself. The email sat unread in my inbox for 3 full days before I finally clicked on it. The subject line was bland, almost corporate: property management opportunity, competitive compensation. In any other situation, I would have dragged it straight to the trash folder, assuming it was just another phishing scam or a recruiter blasting out automated junk. But the sender's name caught my eye: William Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Holdings. I knew the name vaguely from business articles I'd skimmed over the years, a massive conglomerate with real estate all over the Midwest. I'd been between jobs for nearly 4 months. Let me tell you, Wyoming winters are incredibly cruel, but they are exceptionally ruthless to unemployed wilderness guides. The cold seeps into your bones, but the financial anxiety is what truly keeps you awake at night. My savings had dropped to dangerously uncomfortable levels. I was down to eating generic brand oatmeal for 2 meals a day and keeping the thermostat so low I could see my breath in the living room. I clicked on the email, expecting nothing, but desperate enough to consider almost anything. It began formally: Mr. Mitchell, your experience in backcountry management and self-sufficiency has been brought to my attention. I own a substantial property in northwestern Montana requiring on-site maintenance and security. The position offers considerable compensation for a 6-month commitment beginning immediately. I scrolled down, my eyes catching on the salary figure listed near the bottom of the screen. I physically blinked twice, leaning closer to my cracked laptop monitor. It was more than I would make in 2, maybe 3 years of regular guiding work. It was life-changing money, the kind of money that wipes out debt and buys a piece of land of your own. But as I kept reading, the email continued with highly unusual specifics. The property is extremely remote, requiring absolute self-sufficiency. Outside contact will be limited to weekly email reports sent directly to my private office. You must arrive alone. You must remain on the property boundaries for the entire duration of your contract. Hunting is permitted within the designated property lines to supplement the supplies we provide. I sat back in my worn-out armchair, the springs groaning beneath me. It was strange, isolating, and highly restrictive. But my checking account balance was a terrifying single digit. I replied with my resume attached, half expecting it was a cruel joke and I'd never hear back. But within a mere 2 hours, William's response arrived. Attached was a detailed, 20-page legal contract and an extensive PDF of property specifications. The place was massive. Nearly 500 acres of privately owned, heavily timbered land pressed right up against the edge of a national forest near Glacier National Park. The house itself was situated in the absolute middle of nowhere, but the specs promised a bizarre level of luxury for such a remote cabin. It boasted an industrial-grade generator, a state-of-the-art satellite internet setup that was hard-coded for email access only, and a pantry that the document claimed was fully stocked for a year. The contract terms were where things got truly strange. 6 months. Absolute confinement to the property. No visitors under any circumstances. Mandatory weekly check-ins via a secure portal. Extremely rigid equipment maintenance schedules. And a strict requirement to physically patrol the property boundaries twice a week. It read like a bizarre hybrid of high-end house-sitting and top-secret security work, with a heavy, almost paranoid emphasis on absolute privacy. I printed the contract out at the local library, taking it back to my freezing apartment and reading it 3 times over with a cheap beer in my hand. I was looking for the catch. I scoured the pages for anything explicitly illegal, any loophole that meant I was agreeing to something nefarious. Nothing jumped out. The confidentiality sections were ironclad and aggressively detailed, threatening ruinous lawsuits if I spoke about the property to anyone. But that wasn't unheard of with billionaires. The payment schedule is what finally broke down my defenses. Half of the total massive sum would be wired directly into my account immediately upon signing. The remainder would be held in escrow and released upon the completion of the 6 months. Even if I went crazy from cabin fever and walked away halfway through. The upfront payment alone would leave me better off financially than I'd been in my entire adult life. I picked up my phone and called my sister, Beth. She's a practical one in the family, the one who always sees the rust under the fresh paint. I explained the offer to her, carefully dancing around the specific details and the exact location, honoring the non-disclosure agreement I was about to sign. "It sounds way too good to be true, Tom," she said, her voice crackling slightly over the bad connection. "What kind of legitimate company pays that kind of money just to watch a house?" Maybe, I admitted, pacing across my small living room. But the company is completely legitimate. I spent hours checking them out online. They have real estate holdings all over the Midwest, massive commercial properties in Chicago, high-end resort developments up in Michigan. They have the capital. And they want you to live completely alone in the freezing woods for 6 months? Beth pressed, clearly not buying my optimism. "What exactly are you guarding up there, Tom? Nuclear launch codes? Stolen art?" I let out a forced laugh, trying to project a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Just some rich guy's paranoid vacation fortress. I think the property taxes alone on 500 acres must be insane. They just want someone to make sure the pipes don't freeze and the bears don't break in. Just promise me you'll send me the exact GPS location before you go," she insisted, her tone shifting from skeptical to worried. "And call me whenever you can. Check in. I'll email you the minute I get settled, I promised," purposely omitting the deeply unsettling stipulation that the internet was restricted and self-service would be non-existent. That very night, I signed my name on the dotted line of the final page, scanned the documents, and emailed them back to William's office in Chicago. I barely slept. I kept refreshing my banking app, waiting for the illusion to shatter. But 20 minutes after the bank opened the next morning, my phone buzzed with an alert. The first payment had cleared. Staring at that 6-figure number sitting in my checking account instantly vaporized a lingering unease. The money was real. Therefore, the job was real. I spent the next 2 days methodically packing my heavy-duty truck. I approached it with the precision of a man preparing for a deep space mission. I knew wilderness survival, and I knew what 6 months of isolation could do to a person's mind and gear. I packed my heavy hunting rifle and my reliable 12-gauge shotgun. I packed deep-water fishing gear, several lockboxes of extra ammunition, and heavy steel tools for any mechanical or structural repairs I might have to tackle alone. I brought extreme cold weather gear, thermal boots, and crates of my own trusted canned food and MREs to supplement whatever they had waiting for me. I packed 2 boxes of thick paperback books, knowing there wouldn't be any streaming services on the restricted satellite feed. Finally, I built a massive comprehensive first aid kit filled with trauma bandages, splints, and heavy antibiotics. Where I was going, a broken leg or a bad infection could easily be a death sentence if I couldn't call for an airlift. The drive north out of Wyoming was a long, slow transition. The landscape I knew intimately gradually warped into something wilder and far more unforgiving as I crossed the state line into Montana. The mountains grew jagged and immensely tall, throwing long, suffocating shadows across the highway. The pine trees grew denser, packed together so tightly they looked like a solid black wall against the gray sky. I had lived and worked in the deep wilderness for most of my adult life. I was comfortable with isolation, but as my truck ate up the miles, a strange, crawling sensation began to spread across the back of my neck. I had this profound, unsettling feeling of déjà vu. It felt as if I had driven this exact route, taken these exact winding curves 100 times before. "That's impossible," I muttered aloud to the empty cab, gripping the steering wheel tighter as I recognized a specific, jagged silhouette of a mountain peak I knew for a fact I had never seen in my life. The feeling washed over me, heavy and suffocating, then faded as quickly as it had arrived. I forced myself to shake it off, chalking up to highway hypnosis and the adrenaline of the new job. The GPS coordinates fed into my dashboard led me relentlessly toward the rugged western edge of Glacier National Park. The paved highway eventually gave way to a deeply rutted 2-lane road, which then gave way to a narrow gravel path winding through the timber. The bars on my cell phone signal vanished entirely about an hour after I passed through the outskirts of Missoula. By late afternoon, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. I reached Kalispell, the absolute last pocket of significant civilization, before I plunged into the true wild. I pulled my dusty truck into the sprawling parking lot of a massive outfitter store, deciding to make one final, comprehensive supply run. I didn't want any excuses to leave the property once I arrived. Inside the cavernous, brightly lit store, I grabbed even more heavy grain ammunition, bulk packs of lithium batteries, heavy-duty tarps, and additional winter survival gear. Montana winters were legendary, and up in the mountains, they were actively hostile. I hauled my overflowing cart to the register. The cashier, a weathered older man with deep lines carved into his face and a faded flannel shirt, made polite small talk as he scanned the items. "Quite the haul you've got here," he commented casually, his eyes darting over the survival gear and the sheer volume of ammunition. "You headed up into the deep country for the whole hunting season?" "Not exactly," I replied, pulling my credit card from my wallet. "I just took a contract job managing a private property way up near Hungry Horse." The man's hands instantly stopped moving. The rhythmic beeping of the scanner died. He slowly looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. "The Blackwell place?" he asked, his voice suddenly lower, the friendly retail tone entirely gone. I looked back at him, genuinely surprised. "Yeah, actually, you know it?" The man's expression completely closed off. A shadow passed over his features, something cold and unreadable. He looked back down and aggressively resumed scanning my items, moving much faster now, refusing to meet my eyes again. "Been through a whole lot of caretakers, that specific piece of land," he muttered finally, his voice tight as he ripped the long receipt from the machine and shoved it toward me. I frowned, taking the paper. "What exactly do you mean by that? Did the last guy quit?" The old man just shrugged, already turning his back to me and calling out for the next customer in line. "Just saying what I know, buddy. People don't tend to stay long up there. The woods get to them. Have a safe drive." I carried my bags out to the cold parking lot, shoving them into the crowded bed of my truck. I tried to ignore the chill his words had sent down my spine. Every small mountain town had its local folklore, its ghost stories, and its gossip about the eccentric billionaires who bought up the land. I checked my printed directions one final time, put the truck in gear, and pulled back onto the road, driving straight toward the looming Black Mountains. As the afternoon dragged into evening, the roads degraded further. They became incredibly narrow and aggressively twisted as I drove deeper into the untouched Montana wilderness. My heavy truck struggled on some of the steeper, washed-out inclines. The engine whined in protest as I navigated blind, hairpin turns that seemed to double back on themselves entirely. Thick, ancient pine forests crowded the very edges of the loose gravel road. At times, the path narrowed so drastically that thick, dead branches scraped loudly against my side windows, sounding like fingernails dragging across chalkboards. After nearly 3 exhausting hours of driving blind to the dense timber from Kalispell, I rounded one final, violently sharp bend, and the tree line suddenly broke. There it was, the Blackwell property. The house stood in the center of a massive clearing, backed by an impenetrable wall of dense, dark forest and the jagged, snow-capped slopes of a mountain. It was significantly larger than I had imagined from the PDF specifications. It was constructed in a grandiose, rustic mountain style, featuring massive, raw timber beams, riverstone siding, and a wide, sweeping covered porch that wrapped around the front. Despite the remote location, there was something undeniably commanding, almost arrogant, about the architecture. It dominated the landscape, and for a place that supposedly desperately needed a full-time caretaker, the grounds looked shockingly pristine. I pulled my truck up to the front steps and cut the ignition. The engine died, and the sudden, overwhelming silence hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating absence of sound, broken only by the metallic ticking of my cooling engine and the faint, distant call of a solitary bird. I grabbed my heavy duffel bag and the brass keys that William's office had sent to me via secure overnight courier. I pushed the truck door open and stepped out onto the crushed gravel. The air felt completely different up here. It was 10 degrees colder than in town, thin, crisp, and heavy with the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. I stood still for a long moment, simply taking it all in. I noted the perfectly raked gravel of the circular driveway, the cleanly trimmed flagstone path leading to the heavy oak front door, and the massive, mathematically precise stacks of seasoned firewood lining the entire western wall of the house. Nothing looked abandoned. It looked like someone had just stepped out for a walk. I climbed the porch steps. The heavy brass key slid into the lock perfectly. The deadbolt gave way with a loud, solid click that echoed across the empty porch. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, my heavy boots thudding against immaculate, polished Brazilian hardwood floors. The stark contrast between the rugged exterior and the interior caught me entirely off guard. While the outside projected rustic mountain charm, the inside was uncompromisingly modern and aggressively upscale. The main living room featured soaring, 30-foot vaulted ceilings with massive exposed timber beams, but those beams housed sleek, recessed smart lighting and modern architectural fixtures. A sprawling, custom leather sectional sofa sat arranged in front of a monolithic, floor-to-ceiling riverstone fireplace. On either side of the hearth were massive built-in mahogany bookshelves, packed tight with pristine, leather-bound hardcovers. The living space flowed openly into a massive kitchen that looked like it belonged in a Michelin-star restaurant. It featured sprawling black granite countertops, gleaming, brushed stainless steel appliances, a massive 6-burner gas range, and a heavy, professional-grade ventilation hood. Not exactly roughing it, Mitchell, I muttered under my breath, my voice sounding flat and dead in the massive room as I dropped my duffel bag onto the floor. I spent the next 20 minutes doing a preliminary walkthrough of the first floor. The wealth on display was staggering. I found a massive walk-in climate-controlled wine fridge, a state-of-the-art surround sound entertainment setup, and original artwork on the walls that looked like it belonged in a museum. The contract had explicitly stated there was no satellite television access, which made the massive flat screen seem like a bizarre, useless monument. In the center of the kitchen, resting perfectly square on the massive granite island, was a thick, black leather binder. The words property management were embossed deeply into the spine in gold lettering. Placed precisely next to it was a thick, cream-colored envelope with my name, Thomas Mitchell, written across the front in elegant, flowing fountain pen ink. I reached for the envelope first, breaking the heavy wax seal on the back. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock with a short, neatly typed message. Mr. Mitchell, welcome to the property. Everything you need to know regarding your daily duties is contained within the manual. Remember the strict terms of our agreement. Complete and total isolation. Weekly reports submitted on time. Property boundaries must be rigorously maintained and patrolled. The main pantry and the deep freezers are fully stocked to your specifications. Authorized hunting zones are clearly marked on the provided topographical maps. Your first mandatory report is due in exactly 7 days. William Blackwell. The extreme brevity and cold, clinical tone of the note perfectly matched the sterile nature of all our prior email exchanges. There was no warmth, no humanity, just a transaction. I set the heavy paper aside and pulled the thick binder toward me, flipping it open. It wasn't just a manual. It was an obsessively detailed encyclopedia of the property. It contained rigid daily, weekly, and monthly maintenance schedules broken down by the hour. It detailed complex seasonal preparation tasks, extreme weather emergency protocols, and incredibly detailed schematics of the house's plumbing, electrical, and security systems. Tucked into the back pocket were several large, fold-out topographical maps of the property. I unfolded the largest map across the granite island. The property was even more sprawling than I had realized. It was nearly 500 acres of incredibly dense, mountainous private land, bordered entirely by the vast, untamed expanse of the national forest. The map detailed several small outbuildings, a deep, glacial lake to the far north, and vast hunting zones shaded in green. But what caught my immediate attention were the borders. The absolute edges of the Blackwell property were marked on the map by a thick, aggressively bold red line. Printed next to the red line were repetitive, strict warnings emphasizing the absolute necessity of maintaining the physical boundary markers, checking the perimeter fences, and never, under any circumstances, crossing the red line during the duration of the contract. I spent an hour digesting the dense manual before deciding I needed to unpack the truck and physically inspect the critical utility systems before the sun went down completely. Up here, you do want to be fumbling with unfamiliar generators in pitch darkness. I found the generator housed in a dedicated, reinforced concrete outbuilding about 50 yards from the main house. It wasn't a standard backup unit. It was a massive, commercial-grade diesel plant equipped with automatic transfer switches and enough raw output to power a small hotel. The digital readouts showed the massive subterranean fuel tanks were sitting at 98% capacity, according to the meticulous, handwritten maintenance log hanging on a clipboard by the door. The entire system had been fully serviced and tested just 2 weeks prior. I moved on to the water system. It operated on a deep drill well, feeding into a massive, computerized filtration and purification rig in the basement, just like the generator. Everything looked recently and obsessively maintained. Brand new, high-micron filters were installed, and reserve chemicals were lined up on heavy steel shelving with military precision. I grabbed a ladder from the attached garage and climbed up to the icy roof to check the satellite dish. I brushed a thin layer of frost off the receiver, verifying that the heavy-duty cabling was secure and the alignment brackets were locked tight. Back inside the warmth of the house, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. It displayed 0 bars. No service. Exactly as promised. I walked into a small, beautifully appointed office off the main living area. A high-end desktop computer sat dormant on a heavy oak desk. I booted it up. The operating system loaded quickly, and the network icon showed a strong satellite connection. But when I double-clicked the web browser, a stark, custom firewall warning immediately popped up on the screen, indicating block connectivity. I clicked on the email client. It opened instantly, syncing with a pre-configured account. I could send and receive plain text emails. I could not load a single web page, check the news, or access a weather report. Complete digital isolation. I sat down in a heavy leather desk chair and quickly typed out an email to my sister. Beth, I made it to property in one piece. The drive was rough, but I'm here. The house is incredible, way fancier than I ever expected. As predicted, I have absolutely 0 cell service up here, and the internet is severely restricted to email only. So this is going to be my only form of communication for the next 6 months. Don't worry if you don't hear from me constantly. I have tons of supplies, the heat works, and everything is good. I'll check in when I can. Love you, Tom. I hit send, watching the small progress bar at the bottom of the screen confirm a message had gone out into the void. I spent the next 2 solid hours hauling heavy boxes and gear from my truck, organizing my personal supplies. The provided pantry and the massive chest freezers in the basement were indeed stocked to the brim. There was enough high-quality food here to last 2 people a full year. Rows of canned goods, vacuum-sealed cuts of premium meat, dry staples in airtight containers, and even a sprawling rack of expensive wine and top-shelf liquor. I integrated my own survival rations into the mix, arranging my heavy coats, boots, and tactical gear in a large mudroom adjacent to the kitchen. As the deep, freezing evening began to settle in, I cooked a simple meal of steak and potatoes. I carried my plate out onto the expansive back deck. The architecture was designed to showcase the view. The property sloped gently away from the back of the house, offering a wide, unobstructed view of the tree line before the land disappeared entirely into the incredibly thick, suffocating wall of pine trees. The massive, jagged peaks of the mountains rose in the far distance, their snow-capped summits catching the very last, dying golden light of the day before plunging into shadow. It was beautiful. It was profound, majestic isolation. And then I noticed something deeply, inherently wrong. When I had first stepped out onto the deck, the evening forest had been alive with the standard, chaotic symphony of the wilderness. The sharp calls of late-season birds, the rustle of small mammals in the dry underbrush, the gentle hum of insects. Suddenly it all stopped. It wasn't a gradual fading out. It was instantaneous. It was as if a massive, heavy blanket had been violently thrown over the entire forest. The profound silence spread outward like a physical shockwave, moving rapidly from the deep woods in the east, rolling across the property toward the west. It was a dead, unnatural quiet, the kind of silence that makes the blood roar in your own ears. I stood up slowly, leaving my plate on the wooden railing. I narrowed my eyes, peering intensely into the rapidly darkening tree line, my wilderness instincts screaming that a massive apex predator had just entered the immediate vicinity. In the distance, about 200 yards out, the tree line violently exploded. A small herd of at least 6 large mule deer burst from the dense pines. They weren't just running. They were locked in a state of absolute, blind panic. They sprinted full tilt across the open, grassy expanse of property, their eyes wide and white, completely ignoring my presence on the deck as they desperately crashed into the safety of the woods on the far northern side of the house. I stood frozen, gripping the cold wooden railing, my eyes desperately scanning the edge of the forest where the deer had emerged, waiting to see what was hunting them. I expected a massive grizzly or perhaps a mountain lion. Nothing moved. No predator broke the tree line. The shadows between the ancient pines just seemed to grow longer, darker, and infinitely deeper. After 10 agonizing minutes of watching a completely static dead forest, I slowly sat back down. My steak was ice cold. The unnatural, heavy silence lingered, pressing against my eardrums. By the time I forced myself to finish eating, true night had fallen completely. The forest beyond the reach of the powerful exterior deck lights had transformed into an impenetrable, towering wall of absolute blackness. I took my plate inside, locking the heavy glass door behind me and throwing the thick deadbolt. I spent the remainder of the evening conducting a highly paranoid, meticulous sweep of the entire house. I checked every single window latch. I opened every closet door. I took a heavy flashlight down into the sprawling, concrete basement, verifying the locks on the exterior bulkhead doors. I walked to the massive wine cellar and the expansive workshop area, my footsteps echoing loudly. I spent another hour sitting by the living room fireplace, rigorously reading through the emergency protocols in the property manual. Despite the heavy locks and the solid walls, I couldn't shake a creeping, insidious sensation. The primitive part of my brain, the part that kept me alive in the wild, was actively firing warning signals. I felt exposed. I found myself repeatedly, involuntarily glancing over my shoulder at the massive, uncovered windows that faced the dense woods. I felt like I was sitting in a brilliantly lit display case, completely visible to whatever was waiting in the absolute dark outside. When I finally forced myself to go upstairs to the sprawling master bedroom, sheer physical exhaustion from the long, stressful drive should pull me under immediately. Instead, I lay rigidly on top of the expensive duvet, staring blindly up at the dark ceiling. I listened with obsessive intensity to the strange, unfamiliar acoustics of the house. The low, rhythmic hum of the massive refrigerator downstairs. The sharp, sudden crack of massive timber beams settling in the dropping temperature. The soft, mechanical whir of the forced air heating system kicking on. My eyes were heavy, burning with fatigue. I was just hovering on the very edge of sleep, my breathing finally slowing down. Then, a sound completely shattered the night. It cut through the thick walls of the house like a physical blade. It was a noise that defied categorization. It started as a deep, resonant howl that vibrated in my chest, but as it carried through the cold air, it violently shifted, rising in pitch until it warped into a horrific, agonizing approximation of a human scream. It was distant, echoing off the mountainsides, but was clear, piercing, and utterly filled with suffering. My eyes snapped open. I sat bolt upright, my heart slamming violently against my ribs. Adrenaline flooded my system like ice water. I held my breath, straining to listen. In my years as a backcountry guide, I had heard it all. I knew the mournful, echoing howl of timber wolves. I knew the terrifying, woman-like scream of a mountain lion in heat. I knew the bizarre, high-pitched bugle of a massive bull elk during the rut. I knew the sounds of animals dying in the jaws of predators. This was none of those things. It was completely alien. It was too high-pitched, too sustained, too expressive. It carried a weight of intelligent agony that no animal could produce. I sat frozen in the dark. 10 seconds passed. Then the sound erupted again. This time, it was significantly closer. It echoed from the woods just beyond the eastern boundary of the property, followed instantly by a return to that dead, unnatural silence. I threw off the blankets. I didn't turn on a single light. I moved silently across the dark hardwood floor, going straight to the heavy, locked gun case I had hauled upstairs. my hands worked by pure muscle memory in the dark. I pulled out my heavy .30-06 hunting rifle. I racked the bolt, sliding a heavy brass cartridge into the chamber. The metallic clack sounded incredibly loud in the quiet bedroom. I gripped the rifle tight, walking slowly to the massive bedroom window. I pressed my side against the wall, peering out cautiously into the darkness at an angle, keeping my body out of direct view. The property's motion-activated exterior floodlights illuminated a 50-yard radius around the house in stark, clinical white light. Beyond that harsh circle was an absolute abyss. I stared into the blackness until my eyes watered, looking for the telltale, reflective glint of a predator's tapetum lucidum, the glowing eyes of a wolf or a cat. I saw nothing, no movement, no eyes, just the towering, silent silhouettes of the ancient pines. Sleep was entirely off the table. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in a heavy armchair in the corner of the bedroom, the loaded rifle resting across my lap, watching the tree line through the glass. I mentally reviewed the thick property manual. It had dedicated 2 pages to the local wildlife. It gave standard boilerplate warnings about securing trash to avoid attracting black bears. It mentioned carrying bear spray for grizzlies on the northern trails. It noted the presence of mountain lions and small wolf packs. It gave absolutely no special warnings. It hinted at nothing out of the ordinary. I eventually dozed off, purely because my exhausted brain could no longer stay conscious. I drifted off sometime after 3 a.m, my chin resting on my chest, my hands still cramped around the stock of the rifle. My sleep was fractured, restless, and plagued by chaotic, suffocating dreams of running endlessly through a pitch-black forest, hearing heavy, wet footsteps crashing through the brush just inches behind me. The harsh, gray light of a frozen morning filtering through the bedroom windows finally pulled me from the nightmare. I woke up stiff, my neck aching, the heavy rifle slipping from my lap. The absolute terror of the night before felt slightly irrational in the cold, objective light of day. Things always seem worse in the dark. I went downstairs, ground some coffee beans, and brewed a thick, incredibly strong pot of coffee. I poured a heavy mug, zipped up my thickest insulated parka, and stepped out the back door onto the frost-covered deck. My breath plumed in the freezing air. I walked down the wooden stairs, intending to make a wide, circular patrol of the immediate grounds to calm my lingering paranoia. I walked across the frozen, crunching grass toward the eastern edge of the property, exactly where the scream had seemed the closest. I was 30 yards from the tree line when I saw them. My boot stopped moving. I stood completely paralyzed, the hot coffee sloshing over the rim of my mug and burning my bare knuckles. I didn't even feel it. I stared at the soft, half-frozen mud near the edge of the manicured lawn. I slowly walked forward, dropping to a deep crouch, setting the mug down in the frosted grass. They were tracks, but they were utterly defying logic. They were massive. I placed my large, booted foot next to one for scale. The single imprint was easily 15 inches long, sinking nearly 2 inches deep into the packed, freezing earth. The immense weight required to make an impression that deep in this soil was terrifying to calculate. But the sheer size wasn't the most disturbing aspect. It was the anatomy of the print. They didn't belong to a bear. They weren't from a massive wolf or freakishly large cat. They possessed an inherently wrong, almost human-like structure. There was a defined heel pad, leading up to an elongated midsection. But where human toes should be, the print stretched out into horribly long, thin appendages that ended in deep, violent gouges. Claw marks, as thick as my thumb, dug deep into the soil at the tip of each toe. I stood up slowly, my heart rate accelerating, my eyes tracing the path of the tracks. The stride length between each massive print was staggering. The distance from the left footfall to the right suggested a creature with legs incredibly long, moving with a fast, loping, horrifying speed. I followed the trail of ruined earth. The tracks emerged from the dense forest to the absolute north. They had moved in a wide, deliberate arc, coming within 50 yards of the back deck, circling the structure as if visually inspecting the perimeter, and then retreated in the exact same direction they had come from, disappearing back into the suffocating darkness of the tree line. Whatever had made these impossible tracks had spent a significant amount of time in the dark, standing at the edge of the light, simply watching the house, watching me, I stood at the very edge of the woods, the hair on my arm standing straight up. I stared into the chaotic tangle of branches and shadows, intensely aware how utterly alone I was. Despite thousands of hours logged in the deep backcountry, despite an encyclopedic knowledge of North American fauna, my mind drew an absolute, terrifying blank. No animal on this continent leaves a track like this. A strong, rational urge hit me to run inside, boot up the restricted computer, and fire off an urgent, panic email to William Blackwell. But pride and a deep-seated fear of appearing unstable or easily terrified on my literal first day on the job held me back. I couldn't send a message claiming I was being stalked by Bigfoot. I'd be fired, the contract voided, the money revoked. Rationality demanded evidence. I sprinted back to the house, grabbed my high-resolution digital camera, and hurried back out to the mud. I spent 20 minutes photographing the tracks from every conceivable angle. I placed a tape measure next to the deepest impressions to provide undeniable mathematical scale. I took wide shots showing the vast stride length. I documented exactly where they emerged from the trees and where they vanished. I convinced myself this was a smart, professional approach. I would compile the evidence. If the tracks reappeared or the creature returned, I would attach the high-res files to my first mandatory weekly report, completely circumventing the need to sound crazy. I forced myself to spend the remainder of the daylight hours focusing aggressively on highly practical, physical tasks. I chopped a cord of firewood to burn off the nervous adrenaline. I meticulously reorganized my supply crates in the mudroom. I spent 2 hours familiarizing myself with the complex override procedures for the massive diesel generator. In the late afternoon, I decided to test the boundaries. With my loaded rifle slung tight across my chest, I hiked out to the western perimeter. I walked for nearly 2 miles through the dense timber until I found them. Thick, unmistakable red blazes painted aggressively onto the trunks of massive, ancient pines, marking the absolute edge of the Blackwell property. Just beyond the trees, a rusted, heavy-gauge wire fence ran off into the distance, disappearing into the underbrush. I walked the boundary line for an hour, my head on a swivel, my thumb resting permanently on the rifle's safety switch. Every snapping twig, every sudden gust of wind, rattling the dead branches, made me jump. I found myself repeatedly, obsessively scanning the deep shadows of the forest edge, looking for anything that didn't belong. I made absolutely certain I was back inside the heavily locked house long before the sun even began to touch the peaks. That second night, I didn't take any chances. The moment the sun dipped behind the mountains, I went to the massive house and aggressively yanked every single heavy curtain closed, sealing off the sprawling windows. I built a massive, roaring fire in the monolithic stone fireplace, craving the heat and the light. I sat in the leather armchair, my rifle resting on the coffee table within inches of my hand, and tried to read one of the leather-bound books. I didn't comprehend a single word. The horrifying, agonizing scream didn't return that night. But as I sat there in a massive, isolated room, bathed in the orange light of the fire, the oppressive, suffocating feeling of being observed grew stronger. The heavy silence of the house felt less like emptiness and more like anticipation. I couldn't shake the primal, terrifying conviction that something massive and intelligent was standing out there in the freezing darkness, just beyond the glass, waiting patiently. My first 48 hours at the Blackwell property had shattered my confidence. I woke up incredibly early the following morning, my mind instantly locking onto the memory of those massive, clawed tracks in the mud. I needed to leave the property. Not permanently. I couldn't risk the contract, but I desperately needed to break the suffocating tension, to see human faces, to ground myself in reality. After brewing a quick pot of coffee, I sat at the granite island and took inventory. The pantry was incredible, but it was curated for a specific palate. I realized I was missing a few highly practical, blue-collar items that I heavily relied on. I needed more heavy-duty D-cell batteries for my massive tactical flashlights. I needed a specific brand of specialized weather stripping for one of the drafty outbuildings. And frankly, I wanted better, thicker winter gloves than the ones I packed. Going into the nearest town sounded like a brilliant strategic move. I felt genuinely anxious about spending another unbroken 24 hours completely alone on the property, jumping at shadows. Getting out, breathing different air for a few hours seemed incredibly smart. I rummaged through the drawers in the heavy oak desk in the office and found a folded local topographical map. It showed a tiny, unincorporated community called Coram, sitting roughly 20 twisted miles back down the mountain from the property. It was the closest thing to civilization. I tucked my heavy leather wallet into the back pocket of my jeans, grabbed my keys, and locked the massive front door behind me. The morning air was razor-sharp and frigid, but the oppressive atmosphere of the previous night had lifted. The forest seemed to have returned to normal. A small flock of birds chattered noisily in the high branches, and I actually smiled as I watched a fat chipmunk dart erratically across the neatly raked gravel driveway. It felt normal. It felt safe. I climbed into my truck, the engine turning over with a loud, comforting roar. The drive down the mountain toward Coram took me back down the exact same narrow, violently winding gravel roads I had struggled up just days before. In the bright, piercing daylight, the route felt significantly less threatening. The towering pines looked like trees, not looming specters. Yet, even in the daylight, my mind kept dragging me back to the mud, to the massive, elongated toes and the deep gouges of claws. Coram was barely a town. It was more of an accidental widening in the Tulane Mountain Highway. It consisted of a small, clustered handful of weathered wooden buildings surrounded by scattered, isolated cabins hidden in the trees. As I drove slowly down the single main drag, I took inventory. There was a tiny cinder-block post office, a faded diner with neon beer signs in a window, sitting at the far end of the street, and a large, sprawling, two-story wooden building that clearly served as the anchor of the community. Two rusted, antique gas pumps sat out front. Faded, peeling red letters painted across the broad wooden facade read, Sullivan's General Store. A handful of heavily dented pickup trucks and mud-splattered older sedans sat parked haphazardly along the dirt shoulder. I pulled my truck in next to a rusted Ford, cut the engine, and stepped out into the cold air. I walked up the wooden steps. A small brass bell jingled sharply as I pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping from the bright cold into the dim, warm interior. The store smelled incredible, an instant rush of nostalgia. It smelled intensely of fresh ground coffee, old pine floorboards, saddle soap, and a metallic tang of hardware. The aisles were crammed tight with everything from canned beans to chainsaw chains. A woman was standing behind the long wooden counter near the register, actively sorting through a stack of paper invoices. She looked to be in her mid-40s, with bright auburn hair pulled back tight into a functional ponytail. As the bell jingled, she looked up, her eyes locked onto mine. And then, her face broke into a massive, incredibly warm, and entirely familiar smile. It was the kind of smile you give an old friend you haven't seen in a month. "Thomas Mitchell, back already?" she called out cheerfully, her voice echoing slightly in the cluttered store. I stopped dead in my tracks halfway down the aisle. My boots froze on the wooden floorboards. "I thought you usually came in on Thursdays for the big haul," she continued, neatly stacking the invoices and leaning casually against the counter. My brain completely stalled. I stared at her, utterly confused. I had never set foot in this store in my entire life. I had never been to Coram before today, and I certainly had not introduced myself to this woman. I took a slow step forward. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cautious, probing. "Have we actually met before?" The woman's bright smile hesitated. The warmth dialed back just a fraction, replaced by a look of mild amusement. "Very funny, Tom," she chuckled, picking up a pen. "You've been coming in here every single week for, well, Lord, it must be years now. Don't play dumb with me before I've had my second cup of coffee." I walked slowly up the counter, my heart beginning to hammer a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't a joke. Her eyes were completely sincere. "I'm serious," I said, my voice dropping lower, the amusement completely gone. "I just arrived in the state a few days ago." The woman's face changed entirely. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of genuine, deep concern. She leaned forward across the scarred wood counter, looking closely at my face, checking my eyes. "Tom, are you feeling okay?" Did you hit your head up there? I just arrived at the Blackwell property. I stated firmly, articulating every word, trying to establish reality. I signed a contract in Wyoming. This is my absolute first time ever stepping foot in Quorum. The tense exchange had drawn attention. The store wasn't crowded, but there were a few locals browsing the aisles. An older man, wearing a faded Carhartt jacket, who had been meticulously inspecting a rack of fishing lures near the back of the store, turned around. He looked me dead in the eye and gave a familiar, upward nod of his chin. "Mitchell," he acknowledged gruffly. "Good to see you. You have any luck with those night fishing spots out by the ridge I told you about last month?" A wave of pure, absolute ice washed over my entire body. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the man with the lures. I had never seen his face. I had never spoken to him about fishing. I had never been to any ridge. The woman behind the counter, who had to be Emma Sullivan, given the name on the building, let out a small, nervous laugh that sounded forced and entirely devoid of humor. "Tom, you're being really weird today," she said, her voice tight. "You are the caretaker up at the Blackwell place. You've been for ages. You walk in here. You always buy the exact same things. 2 pounds of the dark roast coffee, those specific, expensive D-cell batteries for your weather station rig, and 3 bags of the peppered beef jerky. Every week." Before I could even process the terrifying accuracy of her statement, I literally had D-cell batteries written on the list in my pocket. Another voice chimed in. A middle-aged woman holding a basket of canned goods stepped out from the next aisle over. She looked at me with a warm, maternal nod. "You helped my son, David, when his car broke down on the icy grade last winter, Mr. Mitchell," she said softly. "You waited with him for 2 hours in the snow for the tow truck. Don't you remember that? He still talks about how you gave him your thermal blanket." The floor beneath my boots felt like it was violently tilting. The smell of the coffee and which suddenly made me incredibly nauseous. The edges of my vision began to go dark and fuzzy. I gripped the hard edge of the wooden counter with both hands, my knuckles turning white, physically anchoring myself to the world. These people, these complete strangers in a town I had never visited, were absolutely, fundamentally convinced they knew me. They knew my name, my job, my habits, my actions from a year ago. I think there had been a massive misunderstanding here," I stammered, my voice trembling despite my desperate attempt to keep it steady and deep. "I just took this job. I signed a contract with William Blackwell's office in Chicago last week. I drove up from Wyoming. I arrived 3 days ago." Emma Sullivan's face drained of color. The concern vanished, replaced by a sudden, stark flash of what looked terrifyingly like raw fear. Her eyes darted rapidly from my face to the wall behind the counter, then back to me. She looked quickly at the wall calendar hanging beside the cigarette rack. "Well," she said, her voice suddenly loudly cheerful, a forced, plastic tone that cracked in the middle. "Memory can play terrible tricks on all of us as we get older, right? What exactly can I help you find today, sir?" She had completely shut down. She was aggressively pivoting the conversation back to a sterile, retail transaction. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her shoulders and demand she explain what the hell was happening. But the other customers in the store had stopped pretending to browse. They were all standing completely still, watching me with expressions ranging from intense suspicion to quiet alarm. I couldn't make a scene. Not when I was completely isolated and deeply confused. I needed to act normal, get out and think. Just the batteries, I muttered, pulling away from the counter. And some tools. I walked robotically through the aisles, my hands shaking violently as I blindly grabbed heavy packages of D-cell batteries, a thick roll of duct tape, and a large, comprehensive first aid kit. My mind was completely fracturing, spinning in a million chaotic directions. Had I suffered a psychotic break? Was I experiencing advanced carbon monoxide poisoning from a leak in the cabin? Was this an elaborate, sick psychological test orchestrated by Blackwell Holdings? I brought the items back to the front counter, dumping them unceremoniously. Emma rang them up with mechanical, blinding speed. The forced, plastic friendliness was gone, replaced by a cold, rigid politeness. She refused to make eye contact. "That will be $43.27. she said, staring blankly at the digital readout on the register. I pulled my credit card out, my hands trembling so badly I dropped it on the wood. I snatched it up and slid it into the reader. As the machine beeped, processing the transaction, Emma leaned slowly forward. She didn't look at my face, but she lowered her voice so drastically it was barely a breath, completely inaudible to anyone else in the room. Be incredibly careful up there, Tom. The full moon is coming in a couple of weeks. My head snapped up. What? What does that mean? What moon? Before the words fully left my mouth, she aggressively straightened her posture, snatching the receipt from the printer and forcing a bright, professional smile onto her face. Have a wonderful day now, she practically shouted, handing me the slip of paper. I grabbed my plastic bags and practically bolted for the heavy wooden door, my thoughts a chaotic, swirling mess of pure panic. I shoved the door open, the bell violently jingling, and stepped out onto the cold dirt shoulder. As I walked rapidly toward my truck, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the porch awning. It was an incredibly old man, leaning heavily against the weathered siding of the store. He wore a stained, faded trucker hat and sported a thick, yellowing white mustache that stood out starkly against his deeply tanned, deeply wrinkled face. "Mitchell," he said gruffly, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "Got a minute to talk?" I stopped, my hand hovering over the door handle of my truck. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to get in and drive, but my desperate need for answers rooted me to the spot. I gave a cautious, slow nod. "Robert Thompson," he said, staring at me intently. He didn't offer his hand to shake. "You know exactly who I am." "No, sir, I honestly don't," I replied, my voice hard and flat. "I don't know anyone in this town." Robert's eyes narrowed into small, sharp slits. He studied my face with incredible intensity, looking for a lie, looking for a crack in my facade. "How is the specific situation up at the Blackwell place right now?" he asked, completely ignoring my denial. "What situation?" I shot back, my patience entirely gone. "What the hell is everyone in this town talking about?" Robert Thompson took a slow, deliberate step backward, creating physical distance between us. The hard, intense look on his face dissolved into genuine, profound confusion, followed quickly by pity. You really don't remember, do you?" he whispered, shaking his head slowly. "Remember what? Tell me what I'm supposed to remember." I practically yelled, the panic finally breaking through. "Sorry to bother you, son," he muttered, pulling his jacket tighter around his thin frame. I must have been deeply mistaken. He turned his back on me and walked away down the dirt shoulder with surprising speed, refusing to look back, leaving me standing alone by my truck with heavy plastic bags in my hands and a violently sick, twisting feeling growing deep in the pit of my stomach. I threw the bags onto the passenger seat and climbed into the cab. I locked the doors immediately. I sat there for 5 full minutes, just breathing, trying to forcibly slow my heart rate down. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. I couldn't go back to that massive, empty house yet, not in this state of mind. If I was trapped alone with these chaotic thoughts, I was going to completely lose my grip on reality. I needed to sit down in a brightly lit room. I needed hot food. I needed something normal. I put the truck in gear and slowly drove the 3 blocks down the main street, pulling into a cracked asphalt parking lot of the small diner I had seen earlier. The restaurant was a classic, run-down roadside joint. Chrome siding that had lost its shine decades ago, massive plate glass windows looking out onto the highway, and a faded neon sign buzzing angrily above the door. I walked inside. The bell above this door didn't jingle. It let out a dull thud. The interior was warm, smelling heavily of frying bacon, old grease, and strong bleach. The place was about half full. 3 burly guys in high-visibility logging gear were hunched over massive plates at the long Formica counter. A few older couples and a quiet family sat scattered in the deep, cracked red vinyl booths lining the windows. I deliberately chose an entirely empty booth near the very back of the restaurant, sliding into the vinyl seat and placing my plastic shopping bags carefully next to me. I just wanted to be invisible. I wanted to drink a cup of coffee, eat a heavy meal, and aggressively try to build a rational, logical explanation for what had just happened at the general store. A young waitress with bright bleach blonde hair piled messy on top of her head walked briskly over to my table. She carried a steaming glass pot of coffee and a heavy ceramic mug. She didn't carry a menu. She didn't wait for me to order. She simply slammed the heavy mug down onto the table and began pouring the black coffee. "Hey there, Tom," she said, flashing an easy, incredibly tired smile. "The usual for you today?" I froze. I stared blankly at the plastic name tag pinned to her stained apron. It read Judy. I searched my chaotic brain, frantically trying to place her face, trying to find any hidden memory of this diner, of this woman. I came up entirely, terrifyingly empty. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to look up at her. What exactly would my usual be? I asked, my voice incredibly careful, feeling like I was walking through a minefield blindfolded. Judy stopped pouring. She let out a loud, genuine laugh, shaking her head. "Very funny. You always do this." Denver omelet, heavily burned hash browns, and extra crispy sourdough toast on the side. Same exact order. Every single Thursday morning for the past 5 solid years. The world stopped spinning. It didn't tilt. It just stopped. The blood violently drained from my face. I could feel my skin turning ice cold. Judy's casual smile instantly dropped the second she actually looked at my expression. "Tom?" she asked, her voice dropping, the coffee pot hovering dangerously over the table. "Are you okay? You look like a ghost." I have never, ever been in this restaurant before in my entire life, I stated. My voice didn't sound like my own. It came out harsh, raspy, and completely stripped of emotion. Judy took a very fast, very deliberate step backward. The heavy glass coffee pot rattled slightly against the ceramic mug. Her bright green eyes widened in absolute confusion, bordering on fear. But you come in here every single Thursday morning," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the table. "You always sit in this exact booth. You always drink your coffee black. You sit here and you read the entire local paper while you eat. And you always leave a crumpled $5 bill on the table for a tip, no matter what you end up ordering. Every week. For 5 years." I grabbed the hard plastic edge of the table with both hands. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to be buzzing louder and louder, a deafening mechanical drone. "Judy," I gasped, struggling to pull air into my lungs. "What is today's exact date?" Judy looked terrified now. She slowly backed away, pointing a trembling hand toward a small, cheap promotional calendar taped to the wall directly beside the cash register. It's October 17, Tom." I ripped my cell phone out of my jacket pocket. My thumb frantically stabbed the side button, waking the screen up. The bright digital display glowed harshly against the dim light of the diner. Thursday, October 17th. I stared at the numbers. They burned into my retinas. October 17th. But that was a physical impossibility. That could not be right. It could not be real. I had signed the contract in Wyoming on October 1st. I had spent 2 days packing. I had driven for 2 days. I arrived at the Blackwell property on October 5th. That was yesterday. Or maybe the day before yesterday. It had to be. "I need to go," I blurted out abruptly. I stood up so violently and quickly that my thighs slammed hard against the underside of the heavy table. The table jolted forward. The heavy ceramic mug tipped over, sending scalding black coffee spilling rapidly across the formica, dripping onto the floor. "Tom, wait, are you sick?" Judy asked, her voice high and panicked. "Do you need me to call somebody? Do you need an ambulance?" "I'm fine," I shouted, the volume of my voice making the loggers at the counter whip their heads around to stare at me. "I'm fine. I just really need to go." I frantically dug into my pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and threw it down into the expanding puddle of spilled coffee. I grabbed my plastic bags, turned, and practically ran for the door. I burst out into the freezing air, my chest heaving, gasping for breath like I had been drowning. I threw myself into the cab of my truck, slamming the door shut and aggressively locking it. I sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands were completely numb, desperately, frantically trying to build a logical sequence of events. I unlocked my phone again. The screen still relentlessly displayed October 17th. I opened my phone app with shaking fingers. I navigated to my recent call history. I scrolled down past the missed spam calls. There it was, my last outgoing call. It was to my sister, Beth. The timestamp next to her name read October 4th, the day before I arrived at the massive house. I sat completely paralyzed in the cold cab of the truck. The math was undeniably, horrifyingly simple. I had lost 12 complete days. Almost 2 full weeks of my life were simply gone, erased, deleted from my consciousness. How was that biologically possible? Was I exposed to a chemical leak in the house? Was it extreme trauma? Had I been drugged? And if I had been blacked out for 12 days, what the hell had I been doing? Who was driving my body around? How had I survived? And how did these random people in this isolated town know me so intimately from years ago? When the paperwork proved, I just signed the contract. The drive back up the treacherous, winding mountain road to Blackwell property was an absolute, terrifying blur. I drove mechanically, pure muscle memory guiding the heavy truck around the hairpin curves, while my conscious mind spun out of control, cycling frantically through endless, horrifying possibilities. Each theory was more deeply terrifying than the last. Maybe the stress of the winter and the financial ruin had finally broken me. Maybe I was actively experiencing a severe, prolonged psychotic breakdown, schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder. Maybe there was another man named Thomas Mitchell, a man who looked exactly like me, who had lived here, who had worked this job before me. A massive, bizarre coincidence. Or maybe there was something deeply, fundamentally wrong with the Blackwell property itself. Something that was actively, aggressively destroying my mind, devouring my time, rewriting my reality. When the dense tree line finally broke and my truck pulled violently into the gravel driveway, the massive house looked exactly, perfectly as I had left it that morning. The firewood was stacked. The windows were dark. The profound, suffocating silence of the clearing immediately swallowed the sound of my engine. I didn't care about the tracks in the mud right now. I didn't care about the scream in the night. I left the truck unlocked, sprinting up the porch steps and shoving the heavy brass key into the door. I threw it open, dropped my plastic bags onto the polished hardwood floor, and ran straight for the office. I threw myself into the heavy leather desk chair. I woke the computer from sleep mode, my hand shaking violently as I maneuvered the mouse. I opened the restricted, secure email client. I clicked directly on the sent folder. The screen populated with a list of emails. I stared at them, my blood running absolutely cold. There were 2 emails sitting in the sent folder that I possessed absolutely zero memory of composing. The first was dated October 8th, subject, Weekly Mandatory Report 1. The second was dated October 15th, subject, Weekly Mandatory Report 2. Both emails were addressed directly to William Blackwell's secure server. My hand hovered over the mouse. I felt physically ill. I clicked on the first email, opening it. The text on the screen was incredibly detailed. It was written in my exact voice, utilizing my specific phrasing and vocabulary. It was a comprehensive, professional account of highly specific maintenance tasks I had allegedly performed on the property. It detailed how I had spent 4 hours clearing heavy brush away from the western boundary line markers. It described how I had climbed onto the icy roof and replaced 3 damaged cedar shingles near the main chimney. It included a meticulous, hour-by-hour log of the massive diesel generator's output levels. I scrolled down frantically, opening the second email. This one was even longer. It detailed how I had spent 2 days tracking what I believed to be a massive roe bull elk through the deep northern woods, mapping its territory. It described a sudden, severe drop in temperature and my subsequent winterization of the exterior plumbing fixtures on the outbuildings. I sat back in the heavy chair, pushing myself away from the desk. I was reading my own words, describing intense physical labor, describing days spent alone in the woods, and my mind was entirely blank. It was like reading a highly detailed novel about a stranger whose name happened to be Thomas Mitchell. A massive, overwhelming wave of pure panic crashed over me. I couldn't breathe. The walls of the luxurious office felt like they were violently rushing inward, crushing me. How do you lose 12 days? How do you lose nearly 2 weeks of conscious existence without a single shred of memory, Where was my mind while my body was repairing roofs and tracking animals? What else had I done? I shoved the chair back, so hard it crashed into the bookshelves. I ran upstairs to the master bedroom, tearing through my heavy canvas duffel bag. I pulled out everything, throwing clothes and gear onto the floor until my hands finally closed around a thick, blank, leather-bound notebook and a heavy pen. If my mind was actively failing me, if time was being stolen from me, I needed an anchor. I needed an undeniable, physical record of reality. I sat down hard on the edge of the mattress. I clicked the pen. At the very top of the first blank, white page, I wrote the date in massive, heavy letters. October 17th. Underneath the date, my handwriting sharp and erratic, I began to furiously document every single thing that had occurred since I drove the property gates. I wrote down the bizarre silence of the forest. I wrote down the horrific, unnatural scream in the night. I drew a crude, desperate sketch of the massive, clawed tracks in the mud. Then I wrote a hyper-detailed, obsessive account of the terrifying encounters in Coram. I wrote down Emma Sullivan's name, Judy the waitress, and Robert Thompson. I recorded their exact quotes, their facial expressions, their absolute, unwavering certainty that they had known me intimately for years. I wrote down the terrifying discrepancy of the dates. I wrote about the emails I didn't remember sending. When my hand finally cramped so badly I dropped the pen, I had filled 7 entire pages with cramped, frantic handwriting. I sat there in silence, reading back through my own desperate account. I was reading it as if it might magically reveal a hidden clue, a logical loophole I had missed in my panic. It didn't. It just read like the manifesto of a man rapidly descending into madness. I made a firm, absolute vow to myself right there on the edge of the bed. From this exact moment forward, I would document everything, every single day, every hour, every mundane physical task, every meal, every shadow, every strange noise in the woods. If the time slip happened again, if I woke up and it was suddenly November, at least I would have a physical tether to the truth. I ripped a blank page out of the back of the notebook. With a thick black marker, I wrote in massive block letters, "Check the date on your phone every single morning and night. Write in the journal every single day. Do not trust your memory." I took the thick roll of duct tape I had just bought in town and aggressively taped the paper directly to the center of the bathroom mirror, right at eye level. It would be the first thing I saw when I woke up and the last thing I saw before trying to sleep. I walked slowly back downstairs to the sprawling living room. The afternoon was already burning away. I unpacked the heavy plastic bags from Coram, meticulously organized into massive D-cell batteries, the first aid supplies, and the heavy tools. I forced myself to focus on the incredibly simple, tactile nature of the tasks. Put the battery in the drawer. Put the bandages in the cabinet. It was a desperate attempt to calm the violently racing, chaotic thoughts in my head. Outside the massive windows, the weak autumn sun was already dropping fast behind the jagged mountain peaks. The long, dark shadows of the pine trees were stretching aggressively across the manicured lawn, reaching long, black fingers toward the house. I stood in the center of the luxurious room, staring out into the encroaching darkness of the tree line. I couldn't stop wondering what was going to emerge from those trees when the sun finally disappeared entirely. That night, I didn't just keep my loaded rifle near the bed. I physically slept with the cold steel barrel resting across my chest, my finger resting lightly just outside the trigger guard. The following 3 days devolved into a rigid, obsessive routine driven entirely by pure, unadulterated paranoia. The small leather notebook became my absolute lifeline, my only connection to objective reality. I lived by the pen. Every single morning, I would wake up, immediately stare at the tape warning on the bathroom mirror, grab my phone, and verify the date. October 18th, October 19th, October 20th, time was holding steady. The slippage hadn't returned. Then I would begin the logging. I wrote down everything. I woke at 0600. I ate oatmeal. I checked the exterior locks. Hour by hour, I built a fortress of documentation. Every morning, I would conduct a heavily armed, highly aggressive perimeter sweep of the immediate property. I checked every single first-floor window for smudges or forced entry. I rigorously inspected the heavy oak doors. I walked the edge of the tree line, my eyes locked on the soft earth, desperately searching for a fresh set of those massive clawed tracks. I checked the digital readouts on the massive diesel generator twice a day. I inspected the pressure gauges on the basement water filtration system. I downloaded the memory cards from the motion-activated wildlife cameras I had meticulously positioned around the perimeter of the clearing, plugging them into the computer and analyzing every single frame of footage before the sun went down. In the late afternoons, when the light was still strong, I would cautiously push further out, aggressively exploring the dense property boundaries. I followed the bold red blazes painted on the ancient pines, always keeping the massive roofline of the house within my line of sight. I never let myself get fully swallowed by the woods. I set strict alarms on my watch, ensuring I was locked inside well before dusk. I was functioning, executing the requirements of the contract flawlessly, but my nervous system was constantly redlining. I was hypervigilant, practically vibrating with tension. Every single time my phone screen lit up, my heart rate would spike, terrified the date would jump forward another 2 weeks. I couldn't stop obsessively replaying the bizarre encounters in Coram. The faces of Emma, Judy, and Robert haunted me. People who looked me in the eye and claimed they knew my deepest routines, a life I had supposedly lived in this town, but that I possessed absolutely zero memory of. The terrifying question continuously circled in my mind, refusing to let me sleep. Had I simply suffered a localized amnesiac episode, losing those 12 days? Or was the reality infinitely worse? Was something else entirely happening to me? Was the house doing something to my brain? By the dawn of the 4th day after my panicked flight from the diner, the isolated tension reached a breaking point. I couldn't just sit in the house, rigidly logging my oatmeal and waiting to lose my mind. I needed concrete answers. The sterile property manual, the robotic emails to William Blackwell, and my own paranoid observations weren't enough. I needed to aggressively confront the source. I needed to know exactly why the townspeople recognized my face. I needed to know why Emma Sullivan had looked so genuinely terrified when I forced the issue of my identity. I left the property early, the morning mist still hanging thick and heavy in the lower branches of pines. I drove my truck aggressively down the winding, dangerous mountain road toward Coram. My hands gripped the wheel and the truck took the sharp, blind curves with smooth, terrifying familiarity. I wasn't consciously steering. Muscle memory I didn't know I possessed was guiding the vehicle down the mountain. The realization made me physically sick. The town of Coram looked exactly as it had during my last chaotic visit. It was a bleak, functional outpost. I bypassed the diner entirely and parked my truck aggressively, right up against the wooden steps of Sullivan's General Store. I sat in the cab for a long moment, staring at the peeling red paint on the sign, actively preparing myself for whatever deeply strange, gaslighting conversation was about to happen. I checked my pulse. It was hammering. I stepped out of the truck and walked up the stairs. The brass bell jingled sharply as I shoved the heavy door open. Emma Sullivan was standing behind the wooden counter, exactly where she had been days ago. She was holding a clipboard, actively checking inventory on a rack of heavy work gloves. When the bell rang, she looked up. The moment she saw my face, her hands completely froze. The clipboard slowly lowered to the counter. Unlike my last visit, there was no warm, familiar greeting. There was no cheerful joke about my usual Thursday haul. She didn't act like an old friend. Instead, she stood incredibly still, watching my approach with a guarded, intensely careful expression. "Good morning, Emma," I said, deliberately using her name, attempting to keep my voice aggressively calm and neutral. "I was hoping you and I could have an actual conversation today." Emma's eyes immediately darted around the interior of the store. We were almost entirely alone. There was only one other customer, an incredibly frail old man meticulously inspecting canned vegetables in the absolute farthest aisle back. "What about?" she asked, her voice tight, clipped, and carefully devoid of any emotion. "You know exactly who I am," I said, stepping right up to the heavy wooden counter, keeping my voice low but firm. "Last time I was standing right here, you called me by my first and last name before I even opened my mouth. You told me I had been coming into this specific store for years." Emma's knuckles turned white as her fingers tightened aggressively around the plastic pen she was holding. She looked down at the scratch with the counter. People make mistakes, Tom. It's a small town. Faces blend together. It wasn't just you, I pushed, leaning my weight against the counter, forcing her to look at me. Half the damn town seems to know my face. The waitress at the diner knew my exact breakfast order. A man on the street asked me about night fishing. I have never been here before. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a harsh whisper. I need to understand what the hell is happening up at the Blackwell property, because I think you know exactly what is going on. Emma didn't answer immediately. Her eyes slowly drifted past me, fixing onto the wall behind my head. I turned and followed her gaze. She was staring at the cheap promotional calendar hanging on the wall. The date blocked for today was October 21st. The calendar was covered in small, frantic, handwritten notes scribbled across various dates, deliveries, reminders. But what caught my eye, what made the blood freeze in my veins, was a tiny, meticulously drawn symbol in the box for October 24th. Exactly 3 days from now. It was a small, perfectly round circle, shaded completely black with a silver gel pen. A full moon. Is that the full moon? I asked, pointing a shaking finger at the calendar. Emma looked genuinely terrified now, the careful retail facade entirely shattered. She leaned across the counter, her face inches from mine, and lowered her voice to a desperate, frantic whisper. You need to leave, she breathed, her eyes wide. You need to pack your truck and leave that house before the moon. My heart slammed against my ribs. Leave? Why? What happens? She had said this before. She had warned me. It's not too late this time. What does that mean? This time? Emma violently shook her head, her eyes darting nervously toward the back of the store, where the old man was still slowly shuffling down the aisle. I shouldn't be talking to you about this. I can't talk to you about this. Please, Emma, I begged, all pride completely gone, my voice cracking with genuine desperation. I think I am losing my mind. I think I am losing time. I arrived at the property on October 5th. Then, suddenly, I was standing in your store and it was the 17th. I have absolutely zero memory of those 12 days in between. None. Something fundamental shifted in Emma's expression. The sheer terror was briefly replaced by a profound, agonizing pity. It looked like the expression of someone watching a terminal patient who doesn't yet know they are dying. The Blackwell property. It does things to people. Tom, she whispered, her voice trembling. It changes them. Changes them how? I demanded, gripping the edge of the counter. How does it change them? Emma's hands were visibly shaking now. She frantically reached under the counter, pulled up a heavy cardboard box of loose hardware, and began aggressively, needlessly rearranging the metal bolts inside it, desperate for a physical distraction. I can't help you. I am so sorry, Tom, but I can't. Emma, please. No. Her voice was suddenly firm, harsh, though she kept the volume low. Whatever nightmare is happening up on that mountain, I cannot get involved. None of us in this town can. We know the rules. You need to leave. Right now. Go back. Pack your things, get in your truck, and drive away. Do not stop driving until you are physically across the state line. I tried looking through the digital property records on the computer at the house. I pushed desperately, ignoring her plea. There's absolutely nothing unusual on that hard drive. Just endless maintenance logs and inventory lists. William Blackwell didn't leave anything that explains this. You won't find the real answers in William's sterile computer files, Emma said softly. Her gaze drifted toward a massive front window, looking past the dirt road, staring out toward the jagged, snow-capped mountains visible in the far distance, right where the Blackwell property sat. Try the public library, she whispered, her eyes still fixed on the mountains. It's the small, green building sitting at the very dead end of Pine Street. Marjorie keeps all the physical local archives, the real history. Before I could press her for a single detail more, the heavy brass bell above the door violently jingled. A young, loud couple wearing bright ski gear walked into the store, instantly shattering the suffocating, tense isolation of our conversation. Emma immediately stood up straight, her posture rigid. She aggressively slapped the bright, plastic retail smile back onto her face. It looked like a mask. "Well, please let me know if you need help finding anything else today, sir," she announced loudly, projecting her voice across the store, definitively and permanently ending our conversation. I gave a slow, stiff nod, completely understanding the dismissal. I backed away from the counter, my mind racing. On my way out the heavy door, I paused abruptly by a cheap wire rack holding local newspapers. The top paper was the Hungry Horse News, dated 2 days ago. A small, single-column story on the front page caught my eye. The headline read, "Unusual wildlife activity reported in National Forest." I grabbed the paper and quickly scanned the text. It detailed numerous reports from local hunters and hikers regarding massive herds of elk and deer moving in highly abnormal panic patterns, aggressively migrating away from their typical deep woods feeding grounds and pushing dangerously close to human settlements. A quoted Forest Service spokesperson offered a bland, bureaucratic explanation, attributing the bizarre mass migration to early, severe winter weather patterns disrupting food supplies. Something about the sterile, bureaucratic explanation rubbed me the wrong way. I vividly remembered the panicked deer I had watched from the deck on my very first night at the property. They weren't migrating to find food. They were running for their lives. They were fleeing a perimeter. I dropped a handful of change into the honor box, shoved a newspaper into my jacket pocket, and left the store. I found Pine Street easily. It wasn't hard in a town with only 3 paved roads. The Coram Public Library sat at the absolute dead end, exactly as Emma had described. It was a remarkably small, depressing, single-room building with severely faded, peeling mint green siding and bars on the small windows. I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was intensely dry and smelled heavily of old paper bindings and industrial floor wax. Tall, sagging wooden bookshelves lined the perimeter walls, while 3 incredibly old, bulky computer terminals sat on folding tables in the dead center of the room. A frail, gray-haired woman wearing incredibly thick, wire-rimmed glasses looked up from a cluttered desk near the entrance. She had a thick cardigan wrapped around her shoulders despite the aggressive heat in the room. "Can I help you find something specific today?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "I'm looking for local history information," I said, keeping my tone polite but urgent. "Specifically, I need any archival records regarding the Blackwell property, the large estate up near Hungry Horse." I watched her face closely behind the thick lenses. If she recognized me like Emma and the others had, she was a master of hiding it. Her expression remained completely blank and utterly bored. She simply gave a slow nod and pointed a bony finger toward a heavy wooden door at the very back of the room. "The physical local archives are kept through there," she stated flatly. "We have bound newspapers going back to 1897, county land records, census data, that sort of thing. You need to sign the guest book on the podium before you go in, please." I walked over to the small wooden podium and scrawled my name, Thomas Mitchell, into the heavy, leather-bound registry book she had indicated. I glanced up and down the page. Only 3 other individuals had signed the book in the entire past month. Nobody was looking into the history of this town. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the archive room. The space was windowless and smelled profoundly of decaying paper, dust, and confined age. Rows of massive, dented metal filing cabinets lined one entire wall. Along the opposite wall, heavy, sagging metal shelving units were packed tight with massive, leather-bound volumes of old newspapers. Sitting on a scarred wooden desk in the far corner was a bulky, ancient microfiche reader, looking like a prop from a Cold War movie. I knew exactly where to start. I went straight to the newspaper archives. According to property manual, sitting on the granite island back at the house, the estate had been built in the late 1890s. I began pulling the massive, incredibly heavy-bound volumes down from the shelves, starting with the earliest years William Blackwell had referenced in the digital records. I hauled them over to the desk, flipping carefully through the incredibly fragile, yellowed pages. The very first mention I found of the Blackwell property was in a brittle, crumbling edition of the Hungry Horse News dated October 1903. It was a short, celebratory society piece. It detailed the final completion of a massive, luxurious hunting lodge built exclusively for Chicago industrialist Harold Blackwell. William's great-grandfather. The article praised the architecture and the staggering amount of money spent to conquer the Montana wilderness. I kept searching. I moved forward methodically, chronologically, year by year, turning the fragile pages carefully so they wouldn't disintegrate in my hands. It took 2 hours of reading through crop reports and local obituaries before I found it. In a heavily faded edition from late October 1910, I found a tiny, easily missed notice tucked quietly between a large advertisement for patent medicine and a prominent announcement for a local farmer's market. The headline was small, simple, and entirely chilling: "Caretaker missing." I leaned closer, squinting to read the smudged, tiny ink. Local authorities have officially abandoned extensive search for John Morrison, the resident caretaker of the remote Blackwell hunting property. Morrison, 32, has been officially declared missing since October 26. He was last seen in the town of Coram on October 20th, purchasing a large quantity of winter supplies. Mr. Harold Blackwell has issued a statement from Chicago announcing that his nephew, Samuel Porter, will immediately assume all caretaking duties at the estate. My breath caught in my throat. I sat perfectly still in the silent room. A caretaker going missing in the brutal Montana wilderness in 1910 was inherently supernatural. Men died in the snow all the time. But the date, October 26, right at the end of the month, I frantically pulled down the next massive volume. I began aggressively skimming through the years, skipping forward in large blocks, scanning exclusively for the Blackwell name. I found the next one in 1917. Samuel Porter, longtime resident caretaker of the Blackwell Estate, reported missing by local merchants after failing to arrive for his scheduled monthly supply run. Extensive searches of the property yielded no results. A new caretaker, James Wilson, has taken up residence at the lodge. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. **, 7 years. I threw the volume aside and grabbed the book for the 1920s. I flipped aggressively to 1924. 7 years after 1917, I found the small, buried article almost immediately. October 1924. James Wilson, solitary caretaker of the Blackwell property, is currently presumed dead by local authorities following a sudden and unexplained disappearance. Thomas Brooks has been appointed as the new caretaker by the Chicago Holding Company. I staggered backward, my chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. The pattern was undeniable. It was a horrific mechanical cycle. It repeated over and over and over again like clockwork. Asterisk, 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 every single time. The exact same story played out. A completely different wording, a slightly different placement in the paper, but always the exact same conclusion. A caretaker vanishes without a single trace. A massive search finds absolutely nothing. A new caretaker is instantly appointed to take their place. And the detail that made me physically nauseous, the detail that made my hands shake so badly I could barely turn the fragile pages, was the timing. Almost every single disappearance was officially recorded as occurring in late October. I yanked my cell phone out of my pocket and began frantically photographing the fragile newspaper articles. The flash illuminated the dark room with strobe-like intensity. I needed the undeniable proof. When my search dragged into the volumes from the 1980s and 1990s, the horror escalated from a pattern to a deeply personal nightmare. The newer newspapers occasionally included small, grainy black and white photographs of the newly appointed caretakers. I stared at a photo from 1988. The man, identified as Arthur Pendleton, didn't look exactly like me, but the resemblance was terrifyingly stark. He possessed the exact same broad build, the same dark, slightly wavy hair, the same light-colored eyes. I turned to 1995. The photo of caretaker Michael Vance stared back at me. Again, not a perfect clone, but a man who, if he was wearing my heavy winter coat and had my exact haircut, could easily pass for my brother. They were all men who shared my physical profile. I was hyperventilating now. I grabbed the final, most recent bound volume on the shelf, the 2010s. I threw it onto the desk, aggressively flipping the heavy pages toward the end of the book. I found the article in the October 2016 edition. The headline read, "New Management at Historic Blackwell Estate. Thomas Mitchell has officially taken over full caretaking duties at the historic Blackwell property, following the sudden departure of William Blackwell, who has returned to his Chicago headquarters. My vision completely blurred. I wiped my eyes furiously. Leaning so close to the yellowed page, my nose almost touched the paper. I stared at the grainy black and white photograph printed directly below the text. The man staring back at me from the page, the man identified in print as Thomas Mitchell, was me. It wasn't a man who looked like my brother. It wasn't a man with a similar build. It was a photograph of my exact face. I fell back into a hard wooden chair, my mind completely, violently shattering into a million pieces. I couldn't breathe. The dusty air of the archive room felt thick and unbreathable. According to this official, printed historical record sitting in a public library, I had been the sole caretaker of the Blackwell property since 2016, 7 years ago. But that was a biological impossibility. I had spent the last 7 years working as a backcountry wilderness guide in Wyoming. I had extensive tax records. I had hundreds of paying clients who knew my face. I had an apartment lease. I had my sister, Beth, who would have absolutely, definitively noticed if I had secretly been living alone in a heavily fortified cabin in Montana for the last 7 years of my life. Unless I ripped my phone from my pocket again. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the device onto the heavy newspaper volume. I snatched it up, frantically scrolling through my contacts list until I found Beth's name. I hit call. I held the phone to my ear, squeezing my eyes shut. I knew there was supposed to be absolutely zero cell service anywhere near the property or the surrounding deep valleys. To my absolute shock, the line didn't go dead. It crackled with heavy static, and then impossibly it began to ring. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, the automated click of her voicemail. "Beth, it's Tom," I said, my voice cracking, a desperate, frantic edge bleeding into every word. "I need you to call me back the absolute second you get this message. It is incredibly important. It's an emergency. I need you to tell me exactly when we last saw each other in person." I hesitated, a wave of profound, existential dread washing over me. "And Beth, if you have any recent photographs of us together, anything from the last few years, please, I am begging you, text them to me right now. It is really, really important." I hung up the phone. I stared at the blank screen. I didn't actually expect the text to go through, let alone receive an answer with the horribly spotty service, but I had to try. I needed an anchor to my reality in Wyoming. I hastily gathered my frantic notes. I made sure I had clear photographs of every single article, every single missing caretaker, and especially the 2016 article with my face on it. I practically ran out of the archive room, passing the old librarian without a word. She barely looked up from her computer screen as the door slammed shut behind me. I practically fell into the cab of my truck. I locked the doors and sat there in the driver's seat, staring blindly out the windshield at the faded facade of the library, aggressively trying to force my brain to process the impossible data I had just uncovered. The historical records proved an undeniable pattern. A caretaker disappears into the woods every 7 years. And it always happens right around the October full moon. Emma's terrified. Whispered words echoed relentlessly in my skull. "You need to leave before the moon." Today was October 21st. The calendar in the general store had marked the full moon for the 24th. I had exactly 3 days. If something unnatural, something horrific was actually happening on that property, if the cycle was real, I needed to gather every single piece of information I could find before that moon rose. I needed undeniable physical proof, not just to convince the authorities or William Blackwell or my sister. I needed proof to convince myself that I wasn't completely losing my mind. I put the truck in gear and tore out of Coram. The drive back up the mountain was a nightmare of paranoia. The winding dirt road seemed to stretch on forever. Twice, despite driving this exact route multiple times, I found myself taking completely wrong turns down dead-end logging trails. I had to aggressively back the truck up and double back, my frustration and terror mounting with every lost minute. It was as if the forest itself was actively trying to confuse me, trying to keep me away from the house, or perhaps trying to trap me inside it forever. It was late afternoon. the sun already dipping dangerously low behind peaks by the time my truck finally broke the tree line and pulled into the gravel driveway. The massive house loomed over the clearing, silent and imposing. I didn't go inside. I couldn't bear the thought of being trapped in those luxurious rooms just yet. I had precious daylight left, and I needed to use it. I grabbed my high-res camera from the passenger seat, chambered around in my rifle, and set off toward the western perimeter at a fast, aggressive jog. I was going to document every single inch of the property line. I walked the boundary for 30 minutes, pushing through the thick, dying brush, keeping my eyes locked on the bold red blazes painted on the trees. About a half-mile deep into the woods, far out of sight of the house, I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. It wasn't a painted red blaze. It was a physical carving, deeply gouged into the thick bark of a massive, ancient pine tree. Right at eye level was a complex, horrific symbol. It had been carved with brutal force. The design looked like a crude, primitive representation of some kind of animal, but it was entirely wrong. It depicted a creature with a massive rack of jagged antlers, but the body below the head was wrong. It featured long, stretched-out limbs that bent at unnatural, terrifying angles. I stepped closer, running my gloved fingers over the deep grooves in the wood. The carving was heavily weathered, the edges smoothed by years of harsh wind and snow, but was undeniably deliberate. Someone or something had violently carved this into the tree with immense purpose. I stepped back, raised my camera, and took 3 high-resolution photos of the symbol. I continued walking the perimeter line, moving faster now, the dread sitting heavy in my stomach. 30 yards further down the line, I found another carving. This one was etched deeply into the side of a massive, moss-covered boulder. The exact same symbol. The antlered head, the unnaturally long, broken limbs. I kept walking. I found another carved into a dead, standing trunk. Then another on a rock face. I pulled the topographical map from my jacket pocket, flattening it against a tree trunk. With a red pen, I began meticulously marking the exact GPS location of every single symbol I found. As I plotted the points, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. The symbols weren't randomly scattered. They were spaced precisely 30 yards apart, and every single carving, whether on a tree or a rock, was positioned so that the antlered figure was facing directly inward, facing toward the massive house in the center of the clearing. I spent the next 2 hours practically running the perimeter, documenting the carvings as the light rapidly died. The symbols formed a massive, crude, undeniable circle surrounding the entirety of the Blackwell property. The sun was completely gone, plunging the forest into deep, terrifying shadows. By the time I finally sprinted back across the manicured lawn and locked myself inside the house, I didn't bother taking off my boots. I ran straight into the office, booted up the restricted computer, and rapidly uploaded the dozens of photographs I had just taken. The images of the deep, violent carvings looked even more menacing on the high-definition monitor. I opened the secure email client. I drafted a message directly to William Blackwell's priority address. My fingers hammered the keys with frantic, desperate energy. Mr. Blackwell, I have discovered highly unusual, deliberate markings carved into the trees and rock faces throughout the absolute perimeter of the property boundaries. These appear to be complex, deeply etched symbols depicting an antlered figure. Furthermore, these carvings form a precise, continuous circle facing directly inward toward the main house. In addition to this, I have personally experienced severe, unexplained time discrepancies since my arrival. I have completely lost 12 days of memory. I have also visited the local archives in Coram and discovered a documented, historical pattern of caretaker disappearances occurring exactly every 7 years on this property. I have photographic evidence of men matching my physical description serving as caretakers for decades. Please advise immediately. This is an emergency. Thomas Mitchell. I attached 6 of the clearest photographs of the tree carvings, along with a horrifying picture of the 2016 newspaper article featuring my own face. I hit send. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen. Sent. I collapsed back into the heavy leather chair, burying my face in my hands. I knew, deep down in my gut, that I wouldn't receive a real answer. None of my earlier, detailed weekly reports had garnered anything more than an automated, sterile, received confirmation from a server. William Blackwell was completely isolated in Chicago. I was entirely on my own up here. I forced myself out of the chair. Action was the only thing keeping the sheer panic at bay. I grabbed my tactical gear bag and marched out onto the back deck. I took the high-end motion-sensing wildlife cameras I had brought, the ones meant to capture beautiful footage of elk and bears, and began aggressively repositioning them. I moved them from the distant perimeter and strapped them directly to the heavy porch columns and the nearby trees, aiming the lenses squarely at the house and the immediate yard. If whatever was making those massive, clawed tracks decided to come back tonight, I was going to catch it on high-definition video. That night, I conducted a paranoid, exhaustive lockdown of the house. I checked the heavy deadbolts on the front and back doors 3 times each. I ensured every single ground floor window was locked tight and the heavy blinds were drawn completely shut. I built a massive fire, turned off all the interior lights to avoid silhouetting myself against the windows, and dragged a heavy leather armchair into the direct center of the living room. I sat in the darkness, the .30-06 resting heavily across my lap, staring at the front door. I was physically exhausted, my muscles aching from the aggressive perimeter run, but my mind was completely wired. I couldn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, listening to the agonizing silence of the massive house and the heavy, oppressive quiet of the deep woods outside. Hours dragged by in agonizing slow motion. The fire slowly burned down to glowing red embers. The grandfather clock in the hallway aggressively ticked away the seconds. Midnight, 1 in the morning. Right around 2 a.m., I heard it. It wasn't the distant, echoing scream from the first night. It was much worse. It was intimate. It started as a soft, rhythmic scratching sound. It was coming directly from the exterior wall of the house, right near the massive living room window, only 15 feet away from where I sat. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like heavy, thick nails dragging slowly, deliberately down the rough-hewn timber siding. I completely froze. I stopped breathing. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands went numb. I slowly, agonizingly quietly, stood up from the leather chair. I picked up my heavy tactical flashlight, keeping it clicked off. I moved across the hardwood floor, placing each foot carefully to avoid making a single sound. I pressed my back completely flat against the wall, right next to the window. The scratching sound continued. It was moving. It was slowly, methodically dragging along the side of the house, moving from the living room window toward the kitchen. I followed the sound and inside, moving silently from room to room in the pitch black, tracking the agonizingly slow progress of whatever was outside. I refused to get close enough to the glass to look out. If I could see it, it could see me. Suddenly, the scratching abruptly stopped. The profound, heavy silence that immediately followed was infinitely worse than the noise. I stood frozen in the dark kitchen, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then I heard a new sound. Footsteps, right out front, on the raked gravel of the circular driveway. They were incredibly heavy, crushing the stones with immense weight, but they weren't human. The rhythm was entirely wrong. It was a slow, loping, agonizingly long stride. Crunch, pause, crunch. I crept silently back into the dark front room. I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling across the floor until I reached the heavy curtains covering the front window. I held my breath, reached out with a trembling hand, and pulled the thick fabric back just a fraction of an inch. The motion-sensing floodlights had violently clicked on, flooding the immediate driveway in stark, clinical, blinding white light. I stared through the tiny gap in the curtains. The gravel driveway was completely empty, but right at the very edge of illumination, right where the stark white light violently met the absolute blackness of the tree line, I saw movement. I saw a shape rapidly retreating into the deep timber. It was horrifyingly tall, impossibly tall. It looked incredibly thin, almost skeletal, moving with bizarre, jerky, uncoordinated speed that covered massive amount of ground in a single, terrifying stride. It vanished into the darkness before my brain could even fully process what it was seeing. I dropped the curtain and fell back against the wall, gasping for air. I waited an entire agonizing hour, sitting on the floor in the dark, my rifle aimed squarely at the front door, before I finally gathered the courage to investigate, with the heavy rifle raised and the blinding beam of my tactical flashlight cutting through the dark. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped cautiously out onto the freezing front porch. I swept the powerful beam aggressively across the empty yard, illuminating the trees. Nothing. I lowered the light to the ground. There they were, the exact same massive, elongated footprints I found in the mud days ago. But these were incredibly fresh. They had violently displaced the heavy gravel of the driveway. They circled the entire perimeter of the house, coming horrifyingly close to the front steps, before leading in a straight line back into the deep forest. I turned the beam of the flashlight onto the heavy timber siding of the house. I felt the blood completely drain from my face. Gouged deeply into the thick were 4 massive, parallel scratch marks. They were incredibly deep, tearing through the stain and splintering the raw wood underneath. I walked over to the wall. I reached up, extended my arm as high as I possibly could. My fingertips were completely incapable of reaching the bottom of the lowest scratch mark. Whatever had stood outside this house, dragging its claws down the wall, had to be standing at least 8 feet tall. I bolted back inside, slamming the heavy door shut, throwing the deadbolt, and aggressively dragging a heavy oak side table directly in front of it. I spent the remainder of the night sitting on the floor in the exact center of the living room, completely surrounded by every light I could turn on, my rifle resting across my knees, staring unblinkingly at the barricaded door, actively waiting for the sun to rise. The moment the weak, gray light of dawn finally broke through the windows, I dragged the table away, unlocked the door, and sprinted outside to the nearest trail camera. I ripped the memory card out of the device, ran back inside, and shoved it into computer. I pulled up the video files. 3 separate clips had been recorded during the night. I clicked on the first file. It was a 10-second clip of the empty, illuminated yard. The wind aggressively whipping the pine branches must have falsely triggered the sensor. I clicked the second file. A massive mule deer sprinted frantically across the frame, its eyes wide and glowing in the infrared light, looking back over its shoulder in absolute terror. I clicked the third file. The timestamp in the corner read 2:14 a.m. The video quality was grainy night vision green, partially obstructed by a blowing pine branch in the foreground, but the image was undeniable. Standing right at the absolute edge of the tree line, perfectly still, was a figure. It vaguely possessed the anatomical structure of a human, standing upright on 2 legs, but the proportions were deeply, horrifyingly wrong. It was terrifyingly tall, its torso stretched out like pulled taffy. Its arms hung loosely at its sides, but they were incredibly long, the hands dangling well past its knobby knees. The head was the most incomprehensible part. Where a human face should be, the grainy footage showed something pale and elongated. It looked exactly like the bare, bleached skull of a massive deer. And erupting from the top of that skull was a chaotic, twisted crown of jagged, asymmetrical antlers that looked like broken, reaching fingers. As I watched the terrifying footage loop, the creature's head slowly turned directly toward the hidden camera lens. 2 pinpricks of pure, brilliant white light reflected back from the empty eye socket to the skull. I hit the download button, saving the file to the hard drive, my hand shaking so violently I kept misclicking the mouse. I immediately opened a new email to William Blackwell. I attached the horrific video file and the pictures of the claw marks on the siding. Something is actively stalking this property. I have captured high-definition visual evidence of a massive, unidentified entity standing directly outside the house. It has left deep physical damage on the structure. The local townspeople possess knowledge of this threat, and the timeline suggests the situation will catastrophically escalate with the arrival of the full moon in exactly 3 days. I demand immediate instructions, an extraction protocol, or I will be forced to entirely abandon the contract and this property for my own physical safety. I slammed the enter key. The progress bar crawled. Sent. I sat back, staring at the empty inbox. No immediate reply. No automated message. Nothing. I was completely, utterly isolated. I was locked in a cabin in the deep woods, hunted by something that defied biology, With only 3 days left until whatever horrific cycle Emma Sullivan had warned me about reached its climax, I spent the next 3 days aggressively fortifying the massive house. I abandoned any pretense of maintaining the property for William Blackwell. Survival was the only metric that mattered. I found a stack of heavy plywood sheets in the massive basement workshop. I hauled them upstairs, using a heavy-powered drill and massive lag screws to aggressively board up the weaker ground floor windows, completely plunging the interior of the house into artificial darkness during the day. I tore apart the heavy dining room table, using the solid oak legs to brace the front and back doors. I completely field stripped and cleaned my hunting rifle and my 12-gauge shotgun every single morning, meticulously oiling the actions and loading extra magazines until my thumbs bled. Every single night, the entity returned. It never approached the heavily lit house directly again, but made absolutely certain I knew it was out there. It paced the absolute edge of the tree line. I could hear the incredibly heavy, uneven footfalls crushing the dry brush. I could hear the deep, resonant snapping of massive branches breaking under an impossible weight. And twice, just before dawn, it let out that horrific, echoing scream that sounded like a human being torn apart. The wildlife cameras captured nothing but fleeting, blurred shadows darting between the massive pines, and endless footage of terrified deer fleeing the property. By the time the sun began to aggressively set on October 24th, the sheer, suffocating tension inside the boarded-up house was absolutely unbearable. The air felt incredibly heavy, thick with static electricity and impending violence. I sat in the dim living room, surrounded by my weapons, staring blindly at the date glowing on my phone screen. October 24th, the full moon. I realized with terrifying clarity that I couldn't simply sit inside this wooden box and wait for that impossible, towering monstrosity to inevitably tear through the walls. The plywood felt like paper. The heavy doors felt like glass. The entity was growing bolder, testing the perimeter every single night. Tonight, under the full moon, it would strike. If I was going to die on this mountain, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to see it clearly. I needed to hunt it before it hunted me. I stood up. I put on my heaviest tactical jacket. I slung the .30-06 hunting rifle tight across my back and gripped the 12-gauge shotgun in my hands. I packed a small, heavy backpack with extra boxes of ammunition, a trauma kit, 3 heavy tactical flashlights, and a spare radio. I unbolted the heavy front door, pulling the oak braces away. I stepped out onto the porch. The night air hit my face like a sheet of ice. The temperature had plummeted drastically, far colder than it should be in late October. Every breath I took plumed into a thick, white cloud that hung heavily in the dead, still air. The massive, brilliant full moon was already cresting over the jagged peaks, flooding the entire clearing and the sprawling property in a cold, stark, silver light. The shadows of the ancient pines were incredibly long, pitch black, and sharp as knives. The silence of the forest was absolute. It was the terrifying, heavy quiet of an environment completely devoid of life. No insects, no birds, nothing. I stepped off the porch, my boots crunching violently loudly on the frosted grass. I clicked on my most powerful flashlight, the beam cutting a brilliant white tunnel through the silver moonlight. I walked slowly, deliberately toward the eastern tree line, the exact direction the heavy tracks always retreated into. I found a fresh set of the massive, elongated footprints immediately. They were incredibly deep in the frozen mud, the claw marks gouging the earth. I raised a shotgun, resting the stock tight against my shoulder, and stepped past the boundary of the light. I stepped into the suffocating darkness of the deep woods. I followed the trail. The tracks didn't wander aimlessly. They moved with a terrifying, absolute purpose, driving straight north, moving deeper and deeper into the most remote, heavily timbered section of the sprawling Blackwell property. I walked for over an hour, the adrenaline keeping the freezing cold at bay. The forest grew incredibly dense, the massive pines pressing tightly together, their interlocking branches completely blocking out the moonlight, plunging the trail into pitch blackness. I relied entirely on the narrow beam of my flashlight to follow the gouged earth. Then, exactly 2 miles deep into the woods, the dense wall of trees abruptly ended. I slowed my pace, crouching low, using the thick trunk of a massive pine for cover. Through a narrow gap in branches, I could see an incredibly wide, perfectly circular clearing bathed entirely in brilliant, unhindered moonlight. I turned off my flashlight, letting my eyes completely adjust to the silver light. The clearing was perfectly unnatural. It was roughly 50 feet across, completely devoid of a single tree or bush. The massive pines surrounding the perimeter of the circle were bizarrely deformed. Their massive trunks leaned violently backward, away from the center of the clearing, as if they were physically repulsed by whatever was inside it. I crept right up to the very edge of the tree line, holding my breath. Sitting in the exact, dead center of the massive, illuminated circle was an altar. It was a heavy rectangular slab of dark, heavily weathered stone, standing roughly 4 feet high. The surface was deeply pitted and uneven, covered in decades of dried moss. But even from 50 feet away in the silver moonlight, I could clearly see the thick, dark, heavy stains completely coating the top of the stone. They looked incredibly old, practically baked into the rock, but the moonlight made them glisten with a sickening wet sheen. I lowered my gaze from the altar to the ground surrounding it, carved deeply into bare, frozen earth, forming massive, mathematically perfect concentric circles radiating outward from the stone slab, were the symbols. They were the exact same horrific, antlered figures I had found carved into the boundary trees, etched into the dirt with impossible precision. The air in the clearing was entirely different. It was incredibly heavy, completely stale, and smelled profoundly of old copper and decay. I knelt in the dirt at the edge of the trees, my shotgun raised, my finger trembling against the trigger guard. This was the center. This was the terrifying heart of the Blackwell property. A single, incredibly loud snap of a heavy branch echoed from the deep woods directly behind me. I spun around violently, dropping to one knee, bringing the shotgun up, desperately scanning the pitch-black void between the massive tree trunks. My heart hammered against my ribs like a jackhammer. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice cracking, shattering the oppressive silence of the woods. From the darkness directly ahead of me, a sound answered. It was a low, terrifying, rhythmic rattling. It sounded exactly like a pile of massive, dry bones being violently shaken together. I backed up slowly, inching toward the absolute edge of the illuminated clearing. I reached into my pocket with my left hand, pulling out my heavy flashlight, while keeping the shotgun level with my right. I felt the movement before I saw it. The massive shadows between the trees seemed to shift, warping unnaturally. Something massive was actively circling me, staying perfectly just beyond the visual reach of the moonlight. The heavy rattling stopped entirely. The silence slammed back down. I clicked the flashlight on. The brilliant white beam stabbed aggressively into the darkness. I swept it rapidly back and forth across the tree line. The beam caught it mid-stride. It was stepping out from behind a massive trunk of an ancient pine tree, moving into the light. My brain completely short-circuited. I stared at the absolute impossibility, standing in the beam of my light. It was easily 9 feet tall. Its body was a horrifying, emaciated parody of the human form, stretched out and starved. The skin wasn't skin at all. It looked exactly like dead, gray, cracking tree bark, pulled impossibly tight over protruding, massive bones. Its arms were terrifyingly long, hanging past its knobby knees, ending in massive, multi-jointed hands that terminated in 6-inch, curved, obsidian black claws. But the head broke my mind entirely. It possessed the bleached, elongated skull of a massive stag, but it was entirely corrupted. Erupting from the top of the white bone was a massive, chaotic crown of jagged, asymmetrical antlers that looked like withered, dead branches, intertwining and reaching toward the sky. And set deep within the empty, black voids of the eye sockets were 2 small, burning points of dull, angry red light. It stood completely, perfectly still in the beam of my flashlight. The only movement was a slow, rhythmic, terrifyingly deep rise and fall of its massive, skeletal chest. Then the jaw of the stag's skull unhinged. It dropped open incredibly wide, far wider than the bone structure should physically allow. And from that dark, impossible void, it unleashed a scream. It was deafening. It was a sound of pure, concentrated agony and bottomless rage. echoing violently through the trees, vibrating the actual bones in my chest. Every single survival instinct I possessed violently took over. I didn't think. I just reacted. I raised a heavy 12-gauge shotgun, aimed dead center at its massive chest, and pulled the trigger. The blast was incredibly loud, temporarily deafening me, a massive gout of orange flame illuminating the dark woods. The heavy slug slammed directly into the center of its chest. It was a shot that would drop a charging grizzly bear instantly. The creature didn't even flinch. It didn't stagger. It simply tilted its horrific, antlered skull slightly to the side, regarding me with what looked like terrifying, cold curiosity. I pumped the shotgun, ejecting the smoking red shell, and fired again. I aimed higher this time, putting the massive slug directly into the white bone of its skull. The impact violently shattered a piece of bone near the right eye socket, sending white shards flying into the darkness. The creature didn't scream in pain. The red light in its remaining I simply flared with immense, sudden fury. It dropped onto all four of its unnaturally long limbs, and it charged. I didn't wait to see how fast it could move. I spun around and ran blindly into freezing darkness. Thick pine branches whipped violently across my face, tearing at my skin as I crashed through the dense underbrush. My lungs burned with the icy air, every breath tasting like copper and raw panic. I didn't dare look over my shoulder, but I didn't need to. I could hear it. It wasn't running like an animal. It was moving with an impossible, terrifying efficiency. I could hear the massive, heavy thuds of its limbs striking the frozen earth, the horrifying sound of ancient trees literally splintering and snapping in half as it tore straight through the forest, completely ignoring the obstacles I had to dodge. It wasn't breathing hard. It wasn't exerting effort. It was simply closing the distance. I burst through the final line of trees, my boots hitting the manicured grass of the massive backyard. The house was 100 yards away, bathed in the harsh security lights. It felt like a mile. I sprinted across the open ground, my legs feeling like lead. A horrific, guttural clicking sound echoed directly behind me, so close I could feel the displacement of the air. I reached the wooden stairs of the back deck, taking them 3 at a time. I threw myself at the heavy glass door, fumbling desperately with the keys in the dark. The lock clicked. I shoved the door open, practically falling into the kitchen, and slammed it shut behind me. I threw the deadbolt, dropping the heavy wooden brace into the metal brackets I had screwed into the frame earlier that day. I backed away from the glass, gasping for air, my shotgun raised. Through the thick, reinforced pane, I saw it emerge from the tree line. It didn't rush the house. It stopped exactly at the edge of the light. It slowly rose from all fours, standing to its full, towering height. The shattered piece of white bone on its stag skull was clearly visible. The single red I burned into the kitchen. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, simply watching me. Then it slowly raised one of its impossibly long arms, extending a single massive black claw. It pointed directly at my chest, and then it stepped backward, dissolving into the pitch-black shadows of the forest. I didn't sleep a single second that night. I dragged the heavy kitchen island across the floor, barricading the back door further. I systematically went through the entire house, reinforcing the plywood on the windows, dragging heavy oak furniture in front of every possible entry point. The siege began exactly at 3 a.m. It started with a horrific, deafening crash at the front of the house. The entire structure violently shook. Dust rained down from the vaulted ceilings. I huddled in the center of the living room, my rifle aimed at the barricaded front door. Another crash. The sound of thick, heavy timber actually splintering. It was systematically testing the perimeter, searching for a weak point. I heard the horrifying sound of claws dragging across the roof tiles directly above my head. It was up there, pacing the length of the massive house, its weight making the structural beams groan in agony. Then came the scratching. It moved from the roof down to the reinforced windows. The sound of massive claws tearing through the thick plywood I had installed. It was tearing away, piece by piece. When the first window shattered in the dining room, the sound of breaking glass echoing to the dark house, I knew the ground floor was lost. The barricades wouldn't hold something with that kind of raw, unnatural power. I retreated. I backed slowly into the hallway, pulling the basement door open. I slipped inside, locked a heavy deadbolt, and retreated down the wooden stairs into the concrete bunker. The basement was entirely finished, containing the massive water filtration system, the emergency supplies, and a small, windowless storage room in the far back corner. I locked myself inside that storage room. I pushed a massive metal filing cabinet in front of the door, sat down in the absolute furthest corner, and pulled my knees to my chest. For the next 4 hours, I sat in the pitch black, listening to the destruction of the Blackwell Estate. The entity had fully breached the main floor. The sounds filtering down to the floorboards were apocalyptic. I heard the massive leather sectional being ripped to shreds. I heard the heavy oak bookcases being violently overturned, thousands of books crashing to the floor. It was moving systematically from room to room, tearing the luxurious interior down to the studs. But what terrified me the most wasn't the blind destruction. It was the moments of quiet. Every so often, the violent crashing would stop entirely. I would hear the slow, heavy, deliberate thud of its massive feet pacing across the hardwood floor directly above me. It would stop right above the basement door. I could hear it sniffing at the crack beneath the wood, a wet, heavy, horrifying sound. It knew exactly where I was. It was just waiting. Around 5 a.m, I heard it enter William's pristine office. The destruction there was different. It wasn't just smashing furniture. I heard the distinct sound of heavy desk drawers being ripped open and thrown across the room. I heard the tearing of paper. It sounded like it was frantically searching for something specific. Finally, just as a digital clock on my phone ticked over to 7 a.m, the house went completely, utterly silent. I didn't move for 2 full hours. I sat in the freezing darkness of the concrete room, my finger resting on the trigger of the shotgun, waiting for the basement door to splinter open. When the silence remained unbroken, the sheer instinct to survive finally overrode the paralyzing terror. I slowly pushed the filing cabinet away from the door. Every scrape of metal against concrete sounded like a gunshot. I opened the door and crept silently up the basement stairs. The air filtering down from the main floor was freezing cold. I unlocked the door at the top of the stairs and pushed it open. The devastation was absolute. The beautiful, multi-million-dollar interior had been reduced to a war zone. The front door was completely ripped off its heavy iron hinges, lying in splinters on the ruined hardwood. Every single window on the ground floor was shattered. The cold morning wind was howling through the house, bringing with it a thick dusting of early snow. I didn't hesitate. I didn't pack my bags. I didn't care about the supplies, the money, or the contract. I just needed the keys to my truck. I found them lying in the debris of the kitchen floor. I grabbed my rifle, sprinted to the ruined front entryway, and threw myself into the cab of my truck. The engine roared to life on the first turn of the key. Thank God for heavy-duty batteries. I slammed the shifter into reverse, tires spinning wildly on the rake gravel, throwing stones in every direction. I whipped the truck around and floored the accelerator, tearing down the winding access road, desperate to put as many miles between me and this cursed mountain as physically possible. I drove like a madman. I took the blind curves at terrifying speeds, the heavy truck fishtailing on the loose dirt. I just needed to hit the main highway. I just needed to see another human being. I drove aggressively for 45 minutes, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see that towering, skeletal nightmare leaping through the trees behind me. The dense forest began to thin out ahead. A clearing was approaching. My heart leaped with a sudden, desperate surge of hope. The highway. The truck burst out of the tree line. I slammed on the brakes with both feet. The heavy truck violently locked up, skidding sideways across the gravel, coming to a halt just inches from a massive stack of seasoned firewood. I sat frozen behind the steering wheel, staring out through the windshield. I was parked directly in front of the Blackwell house. The ruined front door, the shattered windows, the splintered porch. It was exactly where I had just fled from. "This is impossible," I whispered, my voice trembling violently. I drove entirely straight. I didn't make a single turn. Panic, cold and absolute, seized my chest. I threw the truck into gear again. I tore out of the driveway, this time turning in the exact opposite direction. I drove aggressively east. I watched the compass on my dashboard, ensuring I maintained a perfect eastern trajectory. I drove for an entire hour, pushing the engine until the temperature gauge began to violently spike. The trees opened up. The clearing appeared. I pulled right back into the driveway of the Blackwell house. I screamed. I hammered my fist against the steering wheel until my knuckles bruised. It was a physical impossibility. Geography didn't work like this. Space didn't fold in on itself. I tried a third time. I took an old, heavily overgrown logging road that branched off to the north. I engaged a four-wheel drive, the truck violently bouncing over massive rocks and fallen logs. I was going to break through the tree line if it killed me. 10 miles down the brutal trail, a massive, deafening crack echoed from beneath the truck. The steering wheel violently jerked to the right, almost snapping my wrists. The front end of the truck dropped hard, metal grinding sickeningly against rock. Steam violently hissed from beneath the crumpled hood. I kicked the door open and stumbled out. The front axle was completely, irreparably snapped in half. The radiator was pouring bright green fluid into the dirt. The truck was dead. I grabbed my rifle from the cab and started walking. I didn't care about the truck. I was going to hike out on foot. I walked for 10 minutes through the dense brush before I saw it. Carved deeply into the trunk of a massive pine tree directly in my path was a horrific, antlered symbol. The exact same symbol I had documented days ago. I looked to my left. 30 yards away, another symbol carved into a boulder. To my right, another symbol on a dead tree. I slowly walked the line, following the carvings. They formed a massive, undeniable curve. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs. I wasn't just lost. I wasn't just disoriented. The symbols I had documented, they weren't just a boundary line. They were a fence. They were an active, supernatural containment field. Whatever dark, ancient magic had carved those symbols into the earth had physically warped the reality within the circle. No matter which direction I drove, no matter what road I took, the spatial geometry within the boundary always, inevitably, violently curved back to the absolute center, the Blackwell house. I was locked in a 2-mile-wide cage, and I was locked in here with a monster. By the time I slowly dragged myself back to the ruined house, the afternoon sun was already sinking dangerously low. The temperature was plummeting. The shattered windows offered absolutely zero protection from a freezing wind. I walked numbly through the destroyed living room. The sheer, overwhelming hopelessness was heavier than fatigue. If I couldn't physically leave the property, my only possible chance of survival was to completely understand the mechanics of the trap. William Blackwell knew about this. The holding company in Chicago knew about this. Every single missing caretaker had been a part of this. There had to be an answer hidden in this house. I walked into the ruin office. The entity had completely torn the room apart during the night, but what was it frantically looking for? I kicked through the knee-deep piles of scattered tax documents and shredded ledgers. I ran my hands over the splintered wood of the heavy oak desk. I checked the hollow spaces behind the torn drywall. Then I noticed a large, framed oil painting hanging askew on the back wall. It was a beautifully rendered landscape of the property itself, painted from a high vantage point. The entity had violently slashed the canvas with its claws, leaving massive, hanging ribbons of painted cloth. But behind the torn canvas, recessed deeply into the wall, was a heavy steel safe with a digital keypad. My heart hammered. The entity hadn't been able to open it. I stared at the keypad. I didn't know the code. I rapidly typed in William's birthday from the public records. A red light flashed. Error. I typed in the address of the Chicago headquarters. Error. I tried the last 4 digits of the company's tax ID. Error. I stepped back, staring at the ruined room. The answer had to be here. I noticed a small, beautifully bound black leather notebook lying half buried under a pile of shredded folders near the overturned desk. I picked it up. It was a journal. The pages were filled with decades of different, distinct handwriting. I carefully flipped through the fragile pages. It was a generational logbook, passed down from caretaker to caretaker. The entries were cryptic, terrifying observations about the forest, the creeping sense of paranoia and horrific, vivid nightmares. I turned to the absolute final entry, written in the sharp, elegant handwriting I immediately recognized from my contract. William Blackwell's handwriting. The entry was dated exactly 7 years ago. October 24th, 2016. The cycle completes tonight. The boundary is at its absolute weakest point. The hunger is unbearable. My skin is hardening. The bones are shifting. The transition cannot be stopped. The new substitute has arrived. The code to the lower level is the absolute beginning. The year the cage was built. I dropped the journal. The year the cage was built. I ran back to the steel safe. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely isolate my index finger. The property manual had stated the original lodge was constructed by Harold Blackwell in the late 19th century. I carefully typed the 4 digits. 1897. The keypad beeped a sharp, high-pitched tone. The red light flipped to a brilliant green. The heavy steel locking bolts retracted with a loud, mechanical thud. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside the small compartment lay a single, thick manila envelope. Written across the front, in William Blackwell's elegant script, was my name, Thomas Mitchell. I ripped the envelope open, pulling out 3 pages of heavy, cream-colored paper. Thomas, if you are reading this, the cycle has already begun. You have discovered the safe, which means you have survived your first encounter with the Guardian. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for what I have done to you, but you must understand I had absolutely no other choice. The Blackwell property is not a hunting lodge. It is not an investment. It is an ancient, supernatural prison. Centuries ago, the indigenous tribes of this valley successfully trapped an entity here, a spirit of absolute, bottomless hunger and consumption, the Wendigo. My great-grandfather, Harold, did not build this house to conquer the wilderness. He built it to exploit the prison. He discovered the boundary, and he discovered the horrific mechanism required to maintain it. The ancient boundary field that keeps the Wendigo trapped within these 2 miles requires a continuous, living power source. It requires a human soul to act as the anchor, but the anchor is slowly, inevitably corrupted by the dark energy of the field. Over the course of exactly 7 years, the anchor is violently transformed into the very monster it is keeping trapped. Every 7 years, during the October full moon, the boundary reaches its absolute weakest point. The current guardian, the monster you saw in the woods, is finally consumed entirely by the curse, fully transitioning into a pure spirit of hunger, ready to break the physical boundary and slaughter the world beyond. To prevent this, a new anchor must be provided, a new caretaker. The house actively chooses its victims. Thomas. It calls to men who share a specific genetic frequency, drawing them in with the one thing they desperately desire. For you, it was financial salvation. For me, 7 years ago, it was complete isolation to escape a ruined reputation. You are the new anchor. By signing the contract, by crossing the boundary line, and sleeping under this roof, you sealed the pact. The transformation has already begun inside yourselves. But the Blackwell family could not simply disappear every 7 years. Questions would be asked. Investigations would be launched. The prison would be discovered. My great-grandfather found a dark, horrific solution, a way to replace the missing men. The true secret of the Blackwell Estate is hidden beneath your feet. There is a second, hidden level beneath the basement. Find the false panel in the study bookshelf. The code is the same. I am sorry, Thomas. There is no escape. I tried everything. The boundary cannot be broken from the inside. Accept your fate as the new guardian. It is the only way to keep the world safe from what I have become. William Blackwell. I stood in the ruined office, the heavy paper trembling in my hands. I wasn't just a security guard. I was a sacrifice, a human battery meant to power an ancient cage, slowly mutating into a cannibalistic monster over the next 7 years, completely isolated in the frozen woods. And William Blackwell, the billionaire CEO who hired me, he was a horrific antler monstrosity currently stalking the woods outside. He had been the caretaker 7 years ago. He had fully turned. But the letter mentioned a replacement, a way to hide the disappearances. I dropped the pages and ran out of the office, sprinting toward the small wood-paneled study adjacent to the living room. The room was miraculously untouched by the entity's rampage. I went straight to the massive, floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves. I frantically began pulling heavy books off the shelves, feeling along the wooden backing for any seams or hidden latches. On the third shelf down, my fingers brushed against a small, concealed metallic depression. I pressed it hard. A loud, mechanical click echoed from behind the wall. The entire massive bookshelf smoothly swung outward on heavy, hidden hinges, revealing a dark, narrow stone staircase, spiraling down into the absolute pitch black. I grabbed my heavy tactical flashlight, clicked it on, and began the descent. The air grew incredibly cold, carrying a sharp, sterile, chemical smell that deeply burned my nostrils, cutting to the scent of old stone. The stairs ended at a heavy, reinforced steel door equipped with a modern digital keypad. I punched in the code, 1897. The heavy locking mechanisms disengaged with a loud hiss of pressurized air. I pulled the heavy door open and stepped inside. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room. I reached out, finding a heavy industrial light switch on the concrete wall. I slammed it upward. Rows of brilliant, harsh fluorescent lights flickered violently to life, aggressively illuminating a massive, subterranean concrete bunker. It looked like a horrific cross between an ancient occult temple and a sterile, high-tech medical facility. The smooth concrete walls were entirely covered in thousands of the dark, carved boundary symbols, painted in what looked terribly like dried blood. Thick, heavy electrical cables and transparent, fluid-filled tubes snaked chaotically across the floor, all converging in the dead center of the massive room. In the center of the bunker, resting on a raised steel platform, was a massive, cylindrical glass vat. The vat was filled with a thick, glowing, translucent amber fluid. Complex life support monitors actively beeped and hummed, tracking vital signs on glowing digital displays attached to the heavy steel base. I walked slowly toward the glass, my boots echoing loudly on the concrete, my heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm in my throat. I stopped right at the edge of the steel platform. I wiped a layer of thick condensation off the cold glass. Floating suspended inside the amber fluid, completely naked, heavily connected to dozens of breathing tubes and intravenous lines, was a man. I stumbled backward, the shotgun clattering loudly to the concrete floor. I fell hard against a metal medical cart, sending surgical tools scattering across the room. I couldn't breathe. The room spun violently. The man floating inside the glass vat was me. It was an absolutely perfect, flawless, biological duplicate. Every single feature was identical. The exact same dark hair floating in the fluid. The exact same broad build. The slight crook in my nose from a bar fight years ago. Even the small, jagged scar above my left eyebrow. I crawled back to glass, pulling myself up, pressing my hands against a freezing cylinder. I was staring directly at my own sleeping face. Resting on a small metal podium next to the life support monitors was another heavy envelope. I ripped it open. The final truth, Thomas. The boundary requires your soul, but the world requires your presence. The dark magic of this prison is capable of incredible, horrifying things. Over the last 7 years, the house has grown a perfect biological continuation of you, a replacement. When the transition occurs tonight under the full moon, when your soul is fully tethered to the boundary and your body begins the agonizing mutation into the guardian, this duplicate will open its eyes. It will wake up possessing every single one of your memories, every childhood trauma, every secret, every skill. It will possess your exact personality. It will literally believe, down to its core, that it is Thomas Mitchell. The boundary will let the duplicate pass. It will pack your truck, drive back down the mountain, and seamlessly resume your life in Wyoming. It will call your sister, Beth. It will laugh at her jokes. It will live the life you were supposed to live, entirely unaware that it is a manufactured clone, while the real you is trapped on this mountain, hunting in the dark, slowly losing your mind to the endless hunger. This is how the Blackwells have maintained the secret for over a century. No one ever goes missing. The caretakers always return to the world, and the world never looks closely enough to notice the coldness behind their eyes. Do not attempt to destroy the replacement. Thomas, it will not break your curse. It will only ensure that when you finally turn, Thomas Mitchell simply ceases to exist in the world. The letter slipped from my trembling fingers, fluttering softly to the concrete floor. I stared at my duplicate floating peacefully in the tank. Its chest rose and fell in a steady, artificial rhythm. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the horror finally locked into place. I wasn't just going to die. I was going to be entirely overwritten. My life, my relationships, my entire existence in the world was going to be stolen and handed to a lab-grown copy, while I was condemned to an eternity of agonizing mutation and cannibalistic hunger in the freezing dark. I placed my hands flat against the cold glass. My own face stared blindly back at me. No, I whispered, my voice echoing harshly in the sterile bunker. No, I refused to fade away in the dark. William Blackwell's letter claimed that destroying the clone wouldn't break the curse on me. It would only erase me from the world. If I was going to lose my humanity, if I was going to become a monster, I was going to make damn sure the world noticed I was gone. I was not going to let this horrific corporation replace me like a broken light bulb. I turned away from the glass vat. I aggressively scanned the subterranean room. In the far corner, heavily secured behind a metal grate, were several massive, red metal drums labeled highly flammable emergency diesel. I ran to the grate, violently kicking it until the cheap padlock snapped. I hauled two of the massive, heavy drums into the center of the room. I unscrewed the metal caps. The overwhelming, suffocating stench of heavy diesel fuel flooded the enclosed space. I began violently kicking the heavy drums over, spilling hundreds of gallons of raw fuel across the concrete floor. It rapidly pulled around the heavy electrical cables, soaking the base of the life support machines, aggressively washing up against the steel platform holding the glass vat. I grabbed a heavy metal wrench from the overturned surgical cart. I walked right up to the massive glass cylinder. I looked at my sleeping face one last time. "I'm sorry," I whispered, "but you don't get my life." I swung the heavy iron wrench with every single ounce of strength I possessed, smashing it directly into the center of the glass. The cylinder violently exploded. Thousands of gallons of thick amber fluid and shattered glass erupted across the room, washing me in a freezing chemical wave. The duplicate violently tumbled out of the shattered tank, landing heavily on the hard concrete floor, severely tangled in the thick plastic breathing tubes and four lines. The life support monitors instantly began screaming, a deafening, high-pitched chorus of critical failure alarms flashing brilliant, chaotic red light across the flooded bunker. The duplicate violently gasped, its chest heaving as it choked on the harsh, cold air. Its eyes snapped open. My eyes. It stared up at me, completely paralyzed, gasping like a dying fish. There was absolutely no recognition in its face. William's letter had lied, or the process hadn't finished. It didn't possess my memories. It didn't possess anything. The eyes were completely, terrifyingly hollow. It was just an empty biological shell. Suddenly, a horrific, deafening scream echoed down the spiral staircase from the house above. It was a guardian, William Blackwell. The sudden destruction of the clone, the violent disruption of the arcane machinery, had severely affected the entity. It sounded like it was in absolute, excruciating agony. I had to move. I pulled a heavy, waterproof flare from my tactical vest. I ripped the cap off and struck the igniter. The flare violently hissed to life, burning with a brilliant, blinding, magnesium-white intensity. I looked down at the empty, gasping shell of myself on the floor. I tossed the burning flare directly into the massive pool of diesel fuel. The ignition was instantaneous and violently explosive. A massive wall of raw, orange flame instantly erupted, sweeping across the concrete floor with a terrifying whoosh. The fire aggressively consumed the electrical cables, climbing rapidly up the sides of the life support machines, melting the plastic and shorting out the internal circuitry in a shower of brilliant blue sparks. The heat was instantly unbearable. I scrambled backward, grabbing my shotgun, and sprinted for the heavy steel door. I didn't look back as I bolted up the spiraling stone stairs, the roaring sound of the inferno echoing loudly behind me. I burst through the hidden bookcase doorway into the ruined study. Thick, black smoke was already aggressively pouring up from a hidden staircase, rapidly filling the first floor of the house. I ran blindly through the destroyed living room, coughing violently, my eyes burning from the acrid smoke. I hit the ruined front doorway and stumbled out onto the freezing front porch, desperately gasping for clean air. I froze. Directly in the center of the raked gravel driveway, bathed in the harsh silver light of the full moon, was the Guardian. But it wasn't standing. It was collapsed on the ground, its unnaturally long limbs violently thrashing and contorting in unnatural angles. The stag skull was thrown back, unleashing continuous, horrific wail of pure, unadulterated agony into the night sky. The ancient magic connecting the boundary, the clone, and the monster was real. By violently destroying the physical anchor point in the basement, I was actively destroying the Guardian. I watched in morbid fascination as the thick, bark-like skin on the creature's chest began to aggressively split open, glowing from within with a horrific, burning orange light. It was burning from the inside out, consumed by the massive inferno, destroying the arcane machinery below. I didn't wait to watch it die. The massive house behind me was fully engulfed, towering flames shooting violently through the shattered roof, sending a massive pillar of black smoke into the night sky. I sprinted past the thrashing, burning monstrosity, throwing myself into the cab of my ruined truck. The engine was dead, the axle was snapped, but pure, irrational adrenaline guided my hands. I aggressively jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it violently. Against all laws of mechanics, the engine roared to life with a deafening, grinding scream. I didn't question it. I slammed the shifter into gear and floored the accelerator. The heavy truck violently lunged forward, metal screaming in protest, as I tore down the gravel driveway, leaving the burning house and the dying monster in the rearview mirror. I hit the main dirt road, driving blindly, aggressively west. I didn't look at the compass. I just drove away from the fire. The trees blurred past in the moonlight. 10 minutes passed. 20 minutes. The temperature gauge on the dash was pegged completely in the red, the engine screaming, but the truck kept moving. 30 minutes. The dense tree line suddenly broke. I burst out into a wide, open valley. Far in the distance, I could clearly see the faint, glowing sodium lights of the highway. I had done it. I had broken through. The burning of the arcane machinery had completely shattered the supernatural boundary. The cage was broken. I was out. I let out a loud, chaotic bark of laughter, tears of sheer relief streaming down my face. I gripped the steering wheel, laughing hysterically into the empty cab. I survived. Then an agonizing, blinding bolt of pure pain violently shot through my right hand. I gasped, my laughter dying instantly. I looked down at the steering wheel. The skin on the back of my right hand had turned entirely, completely gray. It was rough, heavily textured, cracking open like ancient tree bark. No, I whispered, my voice trembling, pure horror freezing the blood in my veins. No, no, no. I desperately tried to open my hand, to flex my fingers. The joints violently resisted, popping with a sickening, grinding crack. My fingers weren't just stiff. They were aggressively stretching. The bones were physically elongating beneath the hardening skin, pushing outward with excruciating force. My fingernails thickened, turning a bruised, deep black, curving aggressively inward into sharp, brutal points. The horrific realization crashed over me, suffocating and absolute. William Blackwell's letter had been entirely correct. The moment I signed that contract, the moment I stepped onto property, the biological transition had been irrevocably triggered. Destroying the clone hadn't broken the curse on my body. It had only prevented my replacement. Destroying the machinery hadn't stopped the mutation. It had only shattered the physical boundary, holding the monster inside the property. I had broken the cage, but the monster was free, and I was a monster. A second wave of excruciating pain violently ripped up my left arm. I screamed aloud in the cab, a sound that cracked and warped, dropping into a deep, guttural register that sounded nothing like a human being. The heavy truck swerved violently across the dirt road as my spine began to violently stretch. I could hear my own vertebrae popping and grinding, physically forcing my torso to elongate. My heavy winter jacket began to tightly restrict my expanding chest, the seams aggressively tearing. I looked into the rearview mirror. The face staring back at me was rapidly losing its humanity. My skin was pulling agonizingly tight across my cheekbones, exposing the harsh shape of the skull beneath. My eyes, normally a light brown, were heavily bloodshot, the whites rapidly turning a sickly, jaundiced yellow as the irises expanded to consume the entirety of the eye. "I am turning," I gasped, the words slurring thickly over teeth that suddenly felt far too large and sharp for my mouth. I couldn't go back to civilization. I couldn't hit the highway without the physical boundary to contain the endless, bottomless hunger growing rapidly in my gut. I would tear through the town of Coram like a plague. I would slaughter innocent people. I would become the nightmare. Through the haze of agonizing pain and rapidly fracturing thoughts, a memory surfaced. A location I had seen on the topographical maps in the destroyed office. Devil's Ridge. It was a massive, sheer cliff drop located exactly 5 miles west of property line, overlooking a deep, jagged, rocky canyon. It was my only way out. My absolute final, conscious human act. I aggressively cranked the steering wheel, forcing the dying truck off the main dirt road and onto a narrow, deeply rutted logging trail that led directly toward the high ridge. The pain was entirely blinding now. My knees were physically crushed tightly against the bottom of the steering column as my legs continued to violently lengthen. The bones in my jaw cracked loudly, shifting forward, elongating my face into a horrific snout. As the truck violently bounced up the steep incline, my mind began to severely fracture. Strange, invasive images violently flashed behind my eyes. Memories that absolutely did not belong to me. I saw a man in heavy 1940s with clothing, running frantically through the halls of the Blackwell house, staring in absolute horror at his own gray, hardening hands. I saw a young man in the 1970s, sobbing uncontrollably as he stared into a bathroom mirror, watching his teeth fall out, replaced by jagged, black points. I felt their raw fear, their absolute denial, their profound, crushing despair, and finally, their terrifying surrender to the endless hunger. These weren't hallucinations. They were the generational memories of the Guardians. Every single caretaker who had suffered this horrific transition before me. The ancient magic was aggressively downloading their collective suffering directly into my mutating brain. The tree line ahead abruptly broke. The trail ended. Directly in front of the truck was the absolute edge of Devil's Ridge, the sheer, terrifying drop into Black Canyon below. I pressed my massive, deformed foot down on the accelerator, pushing the pedal entirely through the rusted floorboard. The dying engine screamed its final, agonizing breath. "This ends with me," I snarled, my voice entirely gone, replaced by a horrific guttural growl. The heavy truck shot forward, launching violently off the absolute edge of cliff. For 3 seconds, there was perfect, weightless silence as the vehicle plummeted through the freezing night air. I closed my yellow eyes, accepting the impact, accepting the darkness. But the crash never came for me. Halfway down the massive drop, a violent, unseen force physically ripped to the cab of the truck. It felt like a massive, invisible hand had grabbed me by the throat. My body was violently, forcefully ejected through the shattered driver's side window. I was thrown upward and backward, defying gravity entirely, while the heavy truck continued its plummet, smashing violently into the jagged rocks at the bottom of the canyon in a massive, distant explosion of twisted metal and fire. I slammed brutally hard onto the rocky ledge just 20 feet below the top of the cliff. The impact should have instantly shattered every single bone in my body. It should have killed me on contact. But I didn't die. The ancient magic of the curse wouldn't allow its new guardian to perish. As I lay broken on the freezing stone, the physical transition rapidly, violently accelerated. The broken bones in my arms and legs didn't just heal. They aggressively lengthened and fused, stretching me out to impossible, terrifying proportions. I opened my mouth to scream in pure agony, but the sound that ripped from my throat was the exact horrific, echoing wail I had heard in the woods on my first night. The skin on my face tore open as the bone structure violently shifted. 2 massive, jagged protrusions violently erupted from the top of my skull, rapidly growing and branching outward into a chaotic, twisted crown of dead antlers. My human consciousness, the memories of Thomas Mitchell, the love for my sister, the fear of death, was violently, aggressively crushed under the unbearable weight of an ancient, bottomless, starving hunger. I slowly pushed myself up off the bloody rocks. I didn't stand on two legs. I crouched on all four of my massive, elongated limbs, my obsidian claws gouging deeply into the stone. I turned my heavy, antlered skull toward the east, toward the faint, distant glow of the highway, toward the small town of Coram. Even from 5 miles away, through the freezing mountain air, I could smell them. I could hear their hearts beating in the dark. I leaped up the side of the cliff face, my claws finding easy purchase in the rock, moving with terrifying, unnatural speed into the freezing, endless night. If you survived this journey into the dark heart of the Blackwell Estate, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a tale. Leo liked to feed the algorithm. And drop a comment down below. What would you have done if you found your own clone sleeping in that basement? Would you have run, or would you have struck the match? Let me know in the comments. Sleep tight, and I'll see you in the next late night story.